Nice, March 10, 1765. Dear Sir, the Colosseum or amphitheatre built by Flavius Vespasian is the most stupendous work of the kind which antiquity can produce. Near one half of the external circuit still remains, consisting of 4 tier of arcades, adorned with columns of 4 orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian and Composite. The height and extent of it may be guessed from the number of spectators it contained, amounting to 100,000, and yet, according to Fontana's mensuration, it could not contain above 34,000 persons sitting, allowing a foot and a half for each person, for the circuit of the whole building did not exceed 1,560 feet. The amphitheatre at Verona is 1,290 feet in circumference, and that of Nismes 1,080. The Colosseum was built by Vespasian, who employed 30,000 Jewish slaves in the work, but finished and dedicated by his son Titus, who on the first day of its being opened produced 50,000 wild beasts, which were all killed in the arena. The Romans were undoubtedly a barbarous people, who delighted in horrible spectacles. They viewed with pleasure the dead bodies of criminals dragged through the streets, or thrown down the scaly Gemoniae and Tarpeian rock, for their contemplation. Their rostra were generally adorned with the heads of some remarkable citizens, like Templebar, at London. They even bore the sight of Tully's head fixed upon that very rostrum, where he had so often ravished their ears with all the charms of eloquence, in pleading the cause of innocence and public virtue. They took delight in seeing their fellow creatures torn in pieces by wild beasts, in the amphitheatre. They shouted with applause when they saw a poor dwarf or slave killed by his adversary, but their transports were altogether extravagant when the devoted captives were obliged to fight in troops, till one side was entirely butchered by the other. Nero produced 400 senators and 600 of the equestrian order as gladiators in the public arena. Even the women fought with wild beasts as well as with each other, and drenched the amphitheatres with their blood. Tacitus says, sed feminarum illustrium, senatorum filium plures per arenam fidati sunt, but many sons of senators, and even matrons of the first rank, exposed themselves in this vile exercise. The execrable custom of sacrificing captives or slaves at the tombs of their masters and great men, which is still preserved among the Negroes of Africa, obtained also among the Antients, Greeks as well as Romans. I could never, without horror and indignation, read that passage in the 23rd book of the Iliad, which describes 12 valiant Trojan captives sacrificed by the inhuman Achilles at the tomb of his friend Patroclus. Dodca men trun megathuman uias ethlus. Tus armor pantas per Ethiae. 12 generous Trojans slaughtered in their bloom. With thy loved corse the fire shall now consume. Even Virgil makes his pious hero sacrifice 8 Italian youths to the Manes of Pallas. It is not at all clear to me that a people is the more brave, the more they are accustomed to bloodshed in their public entertainments. True bravery is not savage but humane. Some of this sanguinary spirit is inherited by the inhabitants of a certain island that shall be nameless but, mum for that. You will naturally suppose that the Colosseo was ruined by the barbarians who sacked the city of Rome. In effect, they robbed it of its ornaments and valuable materials, but it was reserved for the Goths and Vandals of modern Rome to dismantle the edifice and reduce it to its present ruinous condition. One part of it was demolished by Pope Paul II, that he might employ the stones of it in building the Palace of St. Mark. It was afterwards dilapidated for the same purposes by the Cardinals Riarius and Farnese, which last assumed the tiara under the name of Paul III. Notwithstanding these injuries, there is enough standing to convey a very sublime idea of ancient magnificence. The Circi and Naumatia, if considered as buildings and artificial basins, are admirable, but if examined as area intended for horse and chariot races, and artificial seas for exhibiting naval engagements, they seem to prove that the antient Romans were but indifferently skilled and exercised, either in horsemanship or naval armaments. The enclosure of the Emperor Caracalla's circus is still standing, and scarce affords breathing room for an English hunter. The Circus Maximus, by far the largest in Rome, was not so long as the Mall, and I will venture to affirm that St. James's Park would make a much more ample and convenient scene for those diversions. I imagine an old Roman would be very much surprised to see an English race on the course at Newmarket. The Circus Maximus was but 300 yards in breadth. A good part of this was taken up by the Spina, or middle space, adorned with temples, statues, and 2 great obelisks, as well as by the Euripus or canal made by order of Julius Caesar to contain crocodiles and other aquatic animals, which were killed occasionally. This was so large that Heliogabalus, having filled it with excellent wine, exhibited naval engagements in it, for the amusement of the people. It surrounded 3 sides of the square, so that the whole extent of the race did not much exceed an English mile, and when Probus was at the expense of filling the plain of it with fir trees to form a wood for the chase of wild beasts, I question much if this forest was more extensive than the plantation in St. James's Park, on the south side of the canal. Now I leave you to judge what ridicule a king of England would incur by converting this part of the park into a chase for any species of animals which are counted game in our country. The Roman emperors seemed more disposed to elevate and surprise than to conduct the public diversions according to the rules of reason and propriety. One would imagine it was with this view they instituted their naumatia, or naval engagements, performed by half a dozen small galleys of a side in an artificial basin of fresh water. These galleys, I suppose, were not so large as common fishing smacks, for they were moved by 2, 3, and 4 oars of a side according to their different rates, biremes, triremes, and quadriremes. I know this is a knotty point not yet determined, and that some antiquarians believe the Roman galleys had different tires or decks of oars, but this is a notion very ill supported, and quite contrary to all the figures of them that are preserved on antient coins and medals. Suetonius in the reign of Domitian, speaking of these naumatia, says, Edidit navals pugnas, pene justarum classium, effaso, et circumducto juxta Tiberim lacu, atque inter maximas imbres prospectivit. He exhibited naval engagements of almost entire fleets in an artificial lake formed for the purpose hard by the Tiber, and viewed them in the midst of excessive rains. This artificial lake was not larger than the piece of water in Hyde Park, and yet the historian says it was almost large enough for real or entire fleets. How would a British sailor relish an advertisement that a mock engagement between 2 squadrons of men of war would be exhibited on such a day in the Serpentine River, or that the ships of the line taken from the enemy would be carried in procession from Hyde Park Corner to Tower Wharf? Certain it is, Lucullus, in one of his triumphs, had 110 ships of war naves longas carried through the streets of Rome. Nothing can give a more contemptible idea of their naval power than this testimony of their historians, who declare that their seamen or mariners were formed by exercising small rowboats in an enclosed pool of fresh water. Had they not the sea within a few miles of them, and the river Tiber running through their capital, even this would have been much more proper for exercising their watermen than a pond of still water, not much larger than a cold bath. I do believe in my conscience that half a dozen English frigates would have been able to defeat both the contending fleets at the famous Battle of Actium, which has been so much celebrated in the annals of antiquity, as an event that decided the fate of empire. It would employ me a whole month to describe the Thermae or baths, the vast ruins of which are still to be seen within the walls of Rome, like the remains of so many separate citadels. The Thermae Dioclesianae might be termed an august academy for the use and instruction of the Roman people. The pinacotheca of this building was a complete museum of all the curiosities of art and nature, and there were public schools for all the sciences. If I may judge by my eye, however, the Thermae Antonianae built by Caracalla were still more extensive and magnificent. They contained cells sufficient for 2,300 persons to bathe at one time, without being seen by one another. They were adorned with all the charms of painting, architecture, and sculpture. The pipes for conveying the water were of silver, many of the lavacra were of precious marble, illuminated by lamps of crystal. Among the statues were found the famous Toro and Hercule Farnese. Bathing was certainly necessary to health and cleanliness in a hot country like Italy, especially before the use of linen was known. But these purposes would have been much better answered by plunging into the Tiber than by using the warm bath in the Thermae, which became altogether a point of luxury borrowed from the effeminate Asiatics, and tended to debilitate the fibres already too much relaxed by the heat of the climate. True it is, they had baths of cool water for the summer, but in general they used it milk-warm and often perfumed. They likewise indulged in vapour baths in order to enjoy a pleasing relaxation, which they likewise improved with odoriferous ointments. The Thermae consisted of a great variety of parts and conveniences: the natations or swimming places, the portici where people amused themselves in walking, conversing, and disputing together, as Cicero says in Porticibus Deambulantes Disputabunt, the basilicae where the bathers assembled before they entered, and after they came out of the bath, the atria or ample courts, adorned with noble colonnades of Numidian marble and oriental granite, the ephibia where the young men inured themselves to wrestling and other exercises, the frigidaria or places kept cool by a constant draught of air, promoted by the disposition and number of the windows, the calidaria where the water was warmed for the baths, the platanons or delightful groves of sycamore, the stadia for the performances of the athleti, the exedri or resting places provided with seats for those that were weary, the palestri where every one chose that exercise which pleased him best, the gymnasia where poets, orators, and philosophers recited their works, and harangued for diversion, the iliotesia where the fragrant oils and ointments were kept for the use of the bathers, and the conisteria where the wrestlers were smeared with sand before they engaged. Of the thermae in Rome some were mercenary, and some opened gratis. Marcus Agrippa, when he was aedile, opened 170 private baths for the use of the people. In the public baths where money was taken, each person paid a quadrans, about the value of our halfpenny, as Juvenal observes. Cidia Silvano porcum quadrante levari. The victim pig to guard Silvanus slay. And for the public bath a farthing pay. But after the hour of bathing was past, it sometimes cost a great deal more, according to Martial. Balnea post decimum, lasso centumque petunter. Quadrants. The bathing hour is past, the waiter turd. 100 farthings now will be require 500. Though there was no distinction in the places between the first patrician and the lowest plebeian, yet the nobility used their own silver and gold plate, for washing, eating, and drinking in the bath, together with towels of the finest linen. They likewise made use of the instrument called strigil, which was a kind of flesh-brush, a custom to which Persius alludes in this line. I pure et strigils crispini ad balnea defer. Here boy this brush to Crispin's bagno bear. The common people contented themselves with sponges. The bathing time was from noon till the evening, when the Romans ate their principal meal. Notice was given by a bell, or some such instrument, when the baths were opened, as we learn from Juvenal. Red pillam, sonnet is thermarum ludia purgis. Virgin vis sola lotus abdire damum. Leave off, the bath bell ringswat still play on. Perhaps the maid in private rubs you down. There were separate places for the two sexes, and indeed there were baths opened for the use of women only, at the expense of Agrippina, the mother of Nero, and some other matrons of the first quality. The use of bathing was become so habitual to the constitutions of the Romans, that Galen in his book De Sanitate Tuenda mentions a certain philosopher, who, if he intermitted but one day in his bathing, was certainly attacked with a fever. In order to preserve decorum in the baths, a set of laws and regulations were published, and the thermae were put under the inspection of a censor, who was generally one of the first senators in Rome. Agrippa left his gardens and baths, which stood near the Pantheon, to the Roman people. Among the statues that adorned them was that of a youth naked, as going into the bath, so elegantly formed by the hand of Lysippus, that Tiberius, being struck with the beauty of it, ordered it to be transferred into his own palace, but the populace raised such a clamour against him that he was fain to have it reconveyed to its former place. These noble baths were restored by Adrian, as we read in Spartian, but at present no part of them remains. With respect to the present state of the old aqueducts, I can give you very little satisfaction. I only saw the ruins of that which conveyed the Aqua Claudia, near the Porta Maggiore, and the Piazza of the Lateran. You know there were 14 of those antient aqueducts, some of which brought water to Rome from the distance of 40 miles. The channels of them were large enough to admit a man armed on horseback, and therefore when Rome was besieged by the Goths, who had cut off the water, Belisarius fortified them with works to prevent the enemy from entering the city by those conveyances. After that period, I suppose the antient aqueducts continued dry, and were suffered to run to ruins. Without all doubt, the Romans were greatly obliged to those benefactors, who raised such stupendous works for the benefit, as well as the embellishment of their city, but it might have been supplied with the same water through pipes at 100th part of the expense, and in that case the enemy would not have found it such an easy matter to cut it off. Those popes who have provided the modern city so plentifully with excellent water are much to be commended for the care and expense they have bestowed in restoring the streams called Aqua Virgin, Aqua Felis, and Aqua Paulina, which afford such abundance of water as would plentifully supply a much larger city than modern Rome. It is no wonder that 1000. Agrippa, the son-in-law, friend and favourite of Augustus, should at the same time have been the idol of the people, considering how surprisingly he exerted himself for the emolument, convenience and pleasure of his fellow citizens. It was he who first conducted this Aqua Virgin to Rome. He formed 700 reservoirs in the city, erected 105 fountains, 130 casella or conduits, which works he adorned with 300 statues, and 400 pillars of marble in the space of 1 year. He also brought into Rome the Aqua Julia, and restored the aqueduct of the Aqua Marzia, which had fallen to decay. I have already observed the great number of baths which he opened for the people, and the magnificent thermae with spacious gardens, which he bequeathed to them as a legacy. But these benefactions, great and munificent as they seemed to be, were not the most important services he performed for the city of Rome. The common sewers were first made by order of Tarquinius Priscus, not so much with a view to cleanliness, as by way of subterranean drains to the velabrum, and in order to carry off the stagnant water, which remained in the lower parts after heavy rains. The different branches of these channels united at the Forum, from whence by the Cloaca Maxima, their contents were conveyed into the Tiber. This great cloaca was the work of Tarquinius Superbus. Other sewers were added by Marcus Cato and Valerius Flaccus the censors. All these drains having been choked up and ruinous, were cleared and restored by Marcus Agrippa, who likewise undermined the whole city with canals of the same kind, for carrying of the filth. He strengthened and enlarged the Cloaca Maxima, so as to make it capable of receiving a large cart loaded with hay, and directed 7 streams of water into these subterranean passages, in order to keep them always clean and open. If, notwithstanding all these conveniences, Vespasian was put to great expense in removing the ordure from the public streets, we have certainly a right to conclude that the antient Romans were not more cleanly than the modern Italians. After the mausolea of Augustus and Adrian which I have already mentioned, the most remarkable antient sepulchres at Rome are those of Caius Cestius and Cecilia Metella. The first, which stands by the Porta di S. Paolo, is a beautiful pyramid, 120 feet high, still preserved entire, having a vaulted chamber with inside, adorned with some ancient painting which is now almost effaced. The building is of brick but eased with marble. This Caius Cestius had been consul, was very rich, and acted as one of the 7 epulones, who superintended the feasts of the gods called Lectisternia and Pervigilia. He bequeathed his whole fortune to his friend 1000. Agrippa, who was so generous as to give it up to the relations of the testator. The monument of Cecilia Metella, commonly called Capo di Bove, is without the walls on the Via Appia. This lady was daughter of Metellus Creticus, and wife to Crassus, who erected this noble monument to her memory. It consisted of 2 orders or stories, the first of which was a square of hewn stone. The second was a circular tower having a cornice, adorned with ox heads in basso relievo, a circumstance from which it takes the name of Capo di Bove. The ox was supposed to be a most grateful sacrifice to the gods. Pliny, speaking of bulls and oxen, says, Hinc victimi optimi et laudatissima diorum placatio. They were accounted the best victims, and most agreeable to appease the anger of the gods. This tower was surmounted by a noble cupola or dome, enriched with all the ornaments of architecture. The door of the building was of brass, and with inside the ashes of Cecilia were deposited in a fluted marble urn, of curious workmanship, which is still kept in the Palazzo Farnese. At present the surface of the ground is raised so much as to cover the first order of the edifice. What we see is no more than the round tower, without the dome and its ornaments, and the following inscription still remains near the top, facing the Via Appia. Caesali Q Cretici F Metali Crassi to Caecilia Metella, daughter of Q Criticus, wife of Crassus. Now we are talking of sepulchral inscriptions, I shall conclude this letter with the copy of a very singular will, made by Favonius Jocundus, who died in Portugal, by which will the precise situation of the famous temple of Silvanus is ascertained. Jocundi, ego Gallus Favonius Jocundus P. Favoni F. qui bello contra viriatum succubui, jucundum et prudentum filios, imi et quinta fabia conjuge me ortos, et bonorum jucundi patris mei, et aerum, qui mihi ipsia quisivi heredes relinquo. Hac tamen condition, ut ab urb Romana huc venient, et arsa hic me, intra quinquennium exportant. Et violatina condant in sepulchro jussu meo condido, et me voluntate, in quo velim neminum mecum, nec servum, nec libertum inseri, et velim arsa quorum cunc sepulchro statim meo eruanter, et jura Romanorum serventer, in sepulchris ritu majorum retinendis, juxta voluntatem testatoris, et si secus fesserint nisi legitimi orienter corsi, velim e omnia, qui filiges meis relinquo, pro reparando templo de Silvani, quod sub viminali monti est attribui, me nesc mea pont. Max, a flaminibus dialibus qui in Capitolio sunt opum implorant, ad liberorum meorum impietatem ulcissendum, tenin Turk sacerdotes de Silvani me in urbum refera, et sepulchro me meo condera, volo quoque vernes qui domi me sunt, omnis apreter urbano liberos, cum matribus dimiti, singulisque librum argenti puri et vestimonum dori, in Lusitania, in agro 8, cal quintilis bello viriatino. I Gallus Favonius Jocundus, son of P. Favonius, dying in the war against Viriatus, declare my sons Jocundus and Prudens by my wife Quinta Fabia, joint heirs of my estate, real and personal, on condition, however, that they come hither within a time of 5 years from this my last will, and transport my remains to Rome to be deposited in my sepulchre built in the Via Latina by my own order and direction, and it is my will that neither slave nor freedman shall be interred with me in the said tomb, that if any such there be, they shall be removed, and the Roman law obeyed, in preserving in the antient form the sepulchre according to the will of the testator. If they act otherwise without just cause, it is my will that the whole estate, which I now bequeath to my children, shall be applied to the reparation of the temple of the god Silvanus, at the foot of Mount Viminalis, and that my manes the manes were an order of guards supposed to take cognizance of such injuries. I shall implore the assistance of the Pontifex Maximus, and the Flaministiales in the capital, to avenge the impiety of my children, and the priests of Silvanus shall engage to bring my remains to Rome and see them decently deposited in my own sepulchre. It is also my will that all my domestic slaves shall be declared free by the city praetor, and dismissed with their mothers, after having received each a suit of clothes and a pound weight of pure silver from my heirs and executors, at my farm in Lusitania, July 25, during the Viriatin War. My paper scarce affords room to assure you that I am ever, dear sir, your faithful, etc. Letter Roman 33. Nice, March 30, 1765. Dear sir, you must not imagine I saw one half of the valuable pictures and statues of Rome. There is such a vast number of both in this capital, that I might have spent a whole year in taking even a transient view of them, and after all, some of them would have been overlooked. The most celebrated pieces, however, I have seen, and therefore my curiosity is satisfied. Perhaps if I had the nice discernment and delicate sensibility of a true connoisseur, this superficial glimpse would have served only to whet my appetite, and to detain me the whole winter at Rome. In my progress through the Vatican, I was much pleased with the School of Athens, by Raphael, a piece which hath suffered from the dampness of the air. The 4 boys attending to the demonstration of the mathematician are admirably varied in the expression. Mr. Webb's criticism on this artist is certainly just. He was perhaps the best ethic painter that ever the world produced. No man ever expressed the sentiments so happily in visage, attitude, and gesture, but he seems to have had too much phlegm to strike off the grand passions, or reach the sublime parts of painting. He has the serenity of Virgil, but wants the fire of Homer. There is nothing in his Parnassus which struck me, but the ludicrous impropriety of Apollo's playing upon a fiddle, for the entertainment of the 9 muses. Upon better information I must retract this censure, inasmuch as I find there was really a musical instrument among the antients of this figure, as appears by a small statue in bronze, to be still seen in the Florentine collection. The Last Judgment by Buonarroti in the chapel of Sixtus IV produced to my eye the same sort of confusion that perplexes my ear at a grand concert, consisting of a great variety of instruments, or rather when a number of people are talking all at once. I was pleased with the strength of expression, exhibited in single figures and separate groups, but the whole together is a mere mob, without subordination, keeping, or repose. A painter ought to avoid all subjects that require a multiplicity of groups and figures, because it is not in the power of that art to unite a great number in one point of view, so as to maintain that dependence which they ought to have upon one another. Michelangelo, with all his skill in anatomy, his correctness of design, his grand composition, his fire and force of expression, seems to have had very little idea of grace. One would imagine he had chosen his kings, heroes, cardinals, and prelates from among the facchini of Rome, that he really drew his Jesus on the cross from the agonies of some vulgar assassin expiring on the wheel, and that the originals of his bambini with their mothers were literally found in a stable. In the Sala Regia, from whence the Sistine Chapel is detached, we see, among other exploits of Catholic heroes, a representation of the massacre of the Protestants in Paris, Thalaus, and other parts of France, on the eve of St. Bartholomew, thus described in the Discresiani di Roma, nella prima pittura, Esprime Giorgio Vasari e la storia del Caligni, Grand Ammiraglio di Francia, Cicum capo de rebelli e de gluganati, fu ucciso. E nell'altra vicina la strage fatta in Parigi e nel regno de rebelli e de gluganati. In the first picture, George Vasari represents the history of Caligni, High Admiral of France, who was slain as head of the rebels and Huguenots, and in another near it, the slaughter that was made of the rebels and Huguenots in Paris and other parts of the kingdom. Thus the court of Rome hath employed their artists to celebrate and perpetuate, as a meritorious action, the most perfidious, cruel, and infamous massacre that ever disgraced the annals of any nation. I need not mention the two equestrian statues of Constantine the Great and Charlemagne, which stand at opposite ends of the great portico of St. Peter's Church, because there is nothing in them which particularly engaged my attention. The sleeping Cleopatra, as you enter the court of the Belvedere in the Vatican, is much admired, but I was better pleased with the Apollo, which I take to be the most beautiful statue that ever was formed. The Nile, which lies in the open court, surmounted with the little children, has infinite merit, but is much damaged and altogether neglected. Whether it is the same described in Pliny as having been placed by Vespasian in the Temple of Peace, I do not know. The 16 children playing about it denoted the swelling of the Nile, which never rose above 16 cubits. As for the famous group of Laocoon, it surpassed my expectation. It was not without reason that Buonarroti called it a portentous work, and Pliny has done it no more than justice in saying it is the most excellent piece that ever was cut in marble, and yet the famous Fulvius Ursini is of opinion that this is not the same statue which Pliny described. His reasons, mentioned by Montfaucon, are these: the statues described by Pliny were of one stone, but these are not. Antonioli the antiquary has in his possession pieces of Laocoon snakes which were found in the ground, where the baths of Titus actually stood, agreeable to Pliny, who says these statues were placed in the buildings of Titus. Be that as it may, the work which we now see does honour to antiquity. As you have seen innumerable copies and casts of it in marble, plaister, copper, lead, drawings and prints, and read the description of it in Kiesler and 20 other books of travels, I shall say nothing more on the subject, but that neither they nor I nor any other person could say too much in its praise. It is not of one piece indeed. In that particular Pliny himself might be mistaken. Opus omnibus et picturi, et statuarii artis preponendum. Ex uno lapide eam et liberos draconumque mirabilis nexus de conciliae sententia, facere succubi artifices. A work preferable to all the other efforts of painting and statuary. The most excellent artists joined their talents in making the Father and his sons, together with the admirable twinings of the serpents, of one block. Buonarroti discovered the joinings, though they were so artfully concealed as to be before invisible. This amazing group is the work of 3 Rhodian sculptors, called Aegisander, Polydore, and Athenodorus, and was found in the Thermae of Titus Vespasian, still supposing it to be the true antique. As for the torso, or mutilated trunk of a statue, which is called the School of Michelangelo, I had not time to consider it attentively, nor taste enough to perceive its beauties at first sight. The famous horses on Monte Cavallo before the Pope's palace, which are said to have been made in emulation by Phidias and Praxiteles, I have seen, and likewise those in the front of the Capitol, with the statues of Castor and Pollux. But what pleased me infinitely more than all of them together is the equestrian statue of Corinthian brass. Standing in the middle of this piazza, I mean at the Capitol said to represent the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Others suppose it was intended for Lucius Verus, a third set of antiquaries contend for Lucius Septimius Severus, and a fourth for Constantine, because it stood in the piazza of the Lateran Palace, built by that emperor, from whence Pope Paul III caused it to be removed to the capital. I considered the trophy of Marius as a very curious piece of sculpture, and admired the two sphinxes at the bottom of the stairs leading to this piazza, as the only good specimens of design I have ever seen from Egypt, for the two idols of that country, which stand in the ground floor of the museum of the capital, and indeed all the Egyptian statues in the Camera Egyptiaca of this very building, are such monstrous misrepresentations of nature, that they never could have obtained a place among the statues of Rome, except as curiosities of foreign superstition, or on account of the materials, as they are generally of basalts, porphyry, or oriental granite. At the farther end of the court of this museum, fronting the entrance, is a handsome fountain, with the statue of a river god reclining on his urn. This is no other than the famous Marforio, so called from its having been found in Marty's Fore. It is remarkable only as being the conveyance of the answers to the satires which are found pasted upon Pasquin, another mutilated statue, standing at the corner of a street. The marble coffin, supposed to have contained the ashes of Alexander Severus, which we find in one of these apartments, is a curious antique, valuable for its sculpture in basso relievo, especially for the figures on the cover, representing that emperor and his mother Julia Mammia. I was sorry I had not time to consider the antient plan of Rome, disposed in 6 classes, on the staircase of this museum, which was brought hither from a temple that stood in the Forum Boarium, now called Campo Vaccine. It would be ridiculous in me to enter into a detail of the vast collection of marbles, basso relievos, inscriptions, urns, busts, and statues, which are placed in the upper apartments of this edifice. I saw them but once, and then I was struck with the following particulars. A bacchanalian drunk, a Jupiter and Leda at least equal to that in the gallery at Florence, an old presica or hired mourner, very much resembling those wrinkled hags still employed in Ireland, and in the Highlands of Scotland, to sing the coronach at funerals in praise of the deceased, the famous Antinous, an elegant figure, which Pausen studied as canon or rule of symmetry, the 2 fawns, and above all the murmelone or dying gladiator. The attitude of the body, the expression of the countenance, the elegance of the limbs, and the swelling of the muscles in this statue are universally admired, but the execution of the back is incredibly delicate. The course of the muscles called longissimi dorsi are so naturally marked and tenderly executed that the marble actually emulates the softness of the flesh, and you may count all the spines of the vertebrae, raising up the skin as in the living body. Yet this statue, with all its merit, seems inferior to the celebrated dying gladiator of Ctesilas, as described by Pliny, who says the expression of it was such as appears altogether incredible. In the court on the opposite side of the Capitol, there is an admirable statue of a lion devouring an horse, which was found by the gate of Ostia, near the pyramid of Caius Cestius, and here on the left hand under a colonnade is what they call the columna rostrata, erected in honor of Caius Duilius, who first triumphed over the Carthaginians by sea. But this is a modern pillar, with the old inscription, which is so defaced as not to be legible. Among the pictures in the gallery and saloon above, what pleased me most was the Bacchus and Ariadne of Guido Reni, and the wolf suckling Romulus and Remus by Rubens. The court of the Palazzo Farnese is surrounded with antique statues, among which the most celebrated are the Flora with a most delicate drapery, the Gladiator with a dead boy over his shoulder, the Hercules with the spoils of the Nemean lion, but that which the connoisseurs justly esteem above all the rest is Hercules by Glycon, which you know, as well as I do, by the great reputation it has acquired. This admirable statue having been found without the legs, these were supplied by Guglielmo de la Porta so happily, that when afterwards the original limbs were discovered, Michelangelo preferred those of the modern artist, both in grace and proportion, and they have been retained accordingly. In a little house or shed behind the court is preserved the wonderful group of Dirce, commonly called the Toro Farnese, which was brought hither from the Thermae Caracalli. There is such spirit, ferocity, and indignant resistance expressed in the bull, to whose horns Dirce is tied by the hair, that I have never seen anything like it, either upon canvas or in stone. The statues of the 2 brothers endeavouring to throw him into the sea are beautiful figures, finely contrasted, and the rope, which one of them holds in a sort of loose coil, is so surprisingly chiselled that one can hardly believe it is of stone. As for Dirce herself, she seems to be but a subaltern character, there is a dog upon his hind legs barking at the bull, which is much admired. This amazing group was cut out of one stone, by Apollonius and Tauriscus, two sculptors of Rhodes, and is mentioned by Pliny in the 36th book of his Natural History. All the precious monuments of art, which have come down to us from antiquity, are the productions of Greek artists. The Romans had taste enough to admire the arts of Greece, as plainly appears by the great collections they made of their statues and pictures, as well as by adopting their architecture and music. But I do not remember to have read of any Roman who made a great figure either as a painter or a statuary. It is not enough to say those professions were not honorable in Rome, because painting, sculpture, and music, even rhetoric, physic, and philosophy were practiced and taught by slaves. The arts were always honored and revered at Rome, even when the professors of them happened to be slaves by the accidents and iniquity of fortune. The business of painting and statuary was so profitable that in a free republic like that of Rome, they must have been greedily embraced by a great number of individuals. But in all probability, the Roman soil produced no extraordinary genius for those arts. Like the English of this day, they made a figure in poetry, history, and ethics, but the excellence of painting, sculpture, architecture, and music they never could attain. In the Palazzo Piccini I saw three beautiful figures, the celebrated statues of Meleager, the boar and dog, together with a wolf of excellent workmanship. The celebrated statue of Moses by Michelangelo in the Church of St. Peter in Vincula I beheld with pleasure, as well as that of Christ by the same hand in the Church of S. Maria Sopra Minerva. The right foot, covered with bronze gilt, is much kissed by the devotees. I suppose it is looked upon as a specific for the toothache, for I saw a cavalier in years and an old woman successively rub their gums upon it, with the appearance of the most painful perseverance. You need not doubt but that I went to the Church of St. Peter in Montorio, to view the celebrated Transfiguration, by Raphael, which, if it was mine, I would cut in two parts. The three figures in the air attract the eye so strongly, that little or no attention is paid to those below on the mountain. I apprehend that the nature of the subject does not admit of that keeping and dependence which ought to be maintained in the disposition of the lights and shadows in a picture. The groups seem to be entirely independent of each other. The extraordinary merit of this piece, I imagine, consists not only in the expression of divinity on the face of Christ, but also in the surprising lightness of the figure that hovers like a beautiful exhalation in the air. In the Church of St. Luke, I was not at all struck by the picture of that saint, drawing the portrait of the Virgin Mary, although it is admired as one of the best pieces of Raphael. Indeed, it made so little impression upon me that I do not even remember the disposition of the figures. The altar-piece by Andrea Sacchi in the Church of St. Romualdus would have more merit if the figure of the saint himself had more consequence and was represented in a stronger light. In the Palazzo Borghese I chiefly admired the following pieces: a Venus with two nymphs, and another with Cupid, both by Titian, an excellent Roman Piety by Leonardo da Vinci, and the celebrated Muse by Domenichino, which is a fine, jolly, buxom figure. At the Palace of Colorina Conestabile, I was charmed with the Herodias by Guido Reni, a young Christ, and a Madonna by Raphael, and four landscapes, two by Claude Lorraine, and the other two by Salvator Rosa. In the Palazzetto, or summer house belonging to the Palazzo Rospigliosi, I had the satisfaction of contemplating the Aurora of Guido, the colours of which still remain in high perfection, notwithstanding the common report that the piece is spoiled by the dampness of the apartment. The print of this picture by Frege, with all its merit, conveys but an imperfect idea of the beauty of the original. In the Palazzo Barberini there is a great collection of marbles and pictures. Among the first I was attracted by a beautiful statue of Venus, a sleeping faun of curious workmanship, a charming Bacchus lying on an antient sculpture, and the famous Narcissus. Of the pictures, what gave me most pleasure was the Magdalene of Guido, infinitely superior to that by Lebrun in the Church of the Carmelites at Paris, the Virgin by Titian, a Madonna by Raphael but not comparable to that which is in the Palazzo de' Pitti at Florence, and the Death of Germanicus by Poussin, which I take to be one of the best pieces in this great collection. In the Palazzo Falconry there is a beautiful St. Cecilia by Guercino, a Holy Family by Raphael, and a fine expressive figure of St. Peter weeping by Domenichino. In the Palazzo Altieri I admired a picture by Carlo Maradi, representing a saint calling down lightning from heaven to destroy blasphemers. It was the figure of the saint I admired, merely as a portrait. The execution of the other parts was tame enough. Perhaps they were purposely kept down, in order to preserve the importance of the principal figure. I imagine Salvator Rosa would have made a different disposition on the same subject, that amidst the darkness of a tempest, he would have illuminated the blasphemer with the flash of lightning by which he was destroyed. This would have thrown a dismal gleam upon his countenance, distorted by the horror of his situation as well as by the effects of the fire, and rendered the whole scene dreadfully picturesque. In the same palace I saw the famous Holy Family by Correggio, which he left unfinished, and no other artist would undertake to supply, for what reason I know not. Here too is a Judgment of Paris by Titian, which is reckoned a very valuable piece. In the Palazzo Odescalchi there is a Holy Family by Buonarroti, and another by Raphael, both counted excellent, though in very different styles, extremely characteristic of those two great rival artists. If I was silly enough to make a parade, I might mention some hundreds more of marbles and pictures, which I really saw at Rome, and even eke out that number with a huge list of those I did not see. But whatever vanity I may have, it has not taken this turn. And I assure you, upon my word and honour, I have described nothing but what actually fell under my own observation. As for my critical remarks, I am afraid you will think them too superficial and capricious to belong to any other person but your humble servant. Letter Roman 34. Nice, April 2, 1765. Dear Sir, I have nothing to communicate touching the library of the Vatican, which, with respect to the apartments and their ornaments, is undoubtedly magnificent. The number of books it contains does not exceed 40,000 volumes, which are all concealed from the view and locked up in presses. As for the manuscripts, I saw none but such as are commonly presented to strangers of our nation, some very old copies of Virgil and Terence, 2 or 3 missals curiously illuminated, the book De Septem Sacramentis, writ. Latin by Henry VIII, against Luther, and some of that prince's love letters to Anne Boleyn. I likewise visited the Libreria Cassinatants, belonging to the convent of the church called S. Maria Sopra Minerva. I had a recommendation to the principal librarian, a Dominican friar, who received me very politely, and regaled me with a sight of several curious MSS. of the classics. Having satisfied my curiosity at Rome, I prepared for my departure, and as the road between Radicofani and Montefiascone is very stony and disagreeable, I asked the banker Barezzi if there was not a better way of returning to Florence, expressing a desire at the same time to see the Cascade of Terni. He assured me that the road by Terni was 40 miles shorter than the other, much more safe and easy, and accommodated with exceeding good auberges. Had I taken the trouble to cast my eyes upon the map, I must have seen that the road by Terni, instead of being 40 miles shorter, was much longer than the other. But this was not the only mistake of Signor Barezzi. Great part of this way lies over steep mountains, or along the side of precipices, which render travelling in a carriage exceeding tedious, dreadful, and dangerous. And as for the public houses, they are in all respects the most execrable that ever I entered. I will venture to say that a common prisoner in the Marshalsea or King's Bench is more cleanly and commodiously lodged than we were in many places on this road. The houses are abominably nasty, and generally destitute of provision. When eatables were found, we were almost poisoned by their cookery. Their beds were without curtains or bedstead, and their windows without glass, and for this sort of entertainment we paid as much as if we had been genteelly lodged and sumptuously treated. I repeat it again, of all the people I ever knew, the Italians are the most villainously rapacious. The first day, having passed Civita Castellana, a small town standing on the top of a hill, we put up at what was called an excellent inn, where cardinals, prelates, and princes often lodged. Being meagre day, there was nothing but bread, eggs, and anchovies in the house. I went to bed without supper and lay in a pallet where I was half devoured by vermin. Next day our road in some places lay along precipices, which overhang the Nera or Nar, celebrated in antiquity for its white foam, and the sulphureous quality of its waters. Sulphurea nar albus aqua, fontesque velini. Sulphureous Nar and the Velinian streams. It is a small but rapid stream, which runs not far from hence into the Tiber. Passing Utricali near the ruins of the ancient Ocriculum, and the romantic town of Narni, situated on the top of a mountain, in the neighbourhood of which is still seen standing one arch of the stupendous bridge built by Augustus Caesar, we arrived at Terni, and hiring a couple of chaises before dinner, went to see the famous Cascata del Marmor, which is at the distance of 3 miles, we ascended a steep mountain by a narrow road formed for a considerable way along the brink of a precipice, at the bottom of which brawls the furious river Nera, after having received the Velino. This last is the stream which, running from the Lago del Marmor, forms the cascade by falling over a precipice about 160 feet high. Such a body of water rushing down the mountain, the smoke, vapor, and thick white mist which it raises, the double rainbow which these particles continually exhibit while the sun shines, the deafening sound of the cataract, the vicinity of a great number of other stupendous rocks and precipices, with the dashing, boiling, and foaming of the 2 rivers below, produce altogether an object of tremendous sublimity, yet great part of its effect is lost, for want of a proper point of view, from which it might be contemplated. The cascade would appear much more astonishing, were it not in some measure eclipsed by the superior height of the neighbouring mountains. You have not a front perspective, but are obliged to view it obliquely on one side, standing upon the brink of a precipice which cannot be approached without horror. This station might be rendered much more accessible, and altogether secure, for the expense of 4 or 5 zecchines, and a small tax might be levied for the purpose from travellers by the aubergiste at Tourney, who lets his calices for half a zecchine apiece to those that are curious to see. This phenomenon, besides the 2 postilions whom I paid for this excursion at the rate of 1 stage in posting, there was a fellow who posted himself behind one of the chaises, by way of going to point out the different views of the cascade, and his demand amounted to 4 or 5 poles. To give you an idea of the extortion of those villainous publicans, I must tell you that for a dinner and supper, which even hunger could not tempt us to eat, and a night's lodging in 3 truckle beds, I paid 80 poles, amounting to 40 shillings. Sterling, you ask me why I submitted to such imposition. I will tell you I have more than once in my travels made a formal complaint of the exorbitancy of a publican to the magistrate of the place, but I never received any satisfaction, and have lost abundance of time. Had I proceeded to manual correction, I should have alarmed and terrified the women. Had I peremptorily refused to pay the sum total, the landlord, who was the postmaster, would not have supplied me with horses to proceed on my journey. I tried the experiment at Mai in France, where I put myself into a violent passion, had abundance of trouble, was detained till it was almost night, and after all found myself obliged to submit, furnishing at the same time matter of infinite triumph to the mob, which had surrounded the coach, and interested themselves warmly in favour of their townsman. If some young patriot in good health and spirits would take the trouble as often as he is imposed upon by the road in travelling, to have recourse to the fountainhead, and prefer a regular complaint to the controller of the posts, either in France or Italy, he would have ample satisfaction, and do great service to the community. Tourney is an agreeable town, pretty well built, and situated in a pleasant valley, between 2 branches of the river Nera, whence it was called by the Antients Interamna. Here is an agreeable piazza, where stands a church that was of old a heathen temple. There are some valuable paintings in the church. The people are said to be very civil, and provisions to be extremely cheap. It was the birthplace of the Emperor Tacitus, as well as of the historian of the same name. In our journey from hence to Spalido, we passed over a high mountain, called from its height Sama, where it was necessary to have 2 additional horses to the carriage, and the road winds along a precipice, which is equally dangerous and dreadful. We passed through part of Spalido, the capital of Umbria, which is a pretty large city. Of this, however, I give no other account from my own observation, but that I saw at a distance the famous Gothic aqueduct of brick. This is mentioned by Addison as a structure, which, for the height of its arches, is not equalled by anything in Europe. The road from hence to Foligno, where we lay, is kept in good order, and lies through a delightful plain, laid out into beautiful enclosures, abounding with wine, oil, corn, and cattle, and watered by the pastoral streams of the famous river Clytemnus, which takes its rise in 3 or 4 separate rivulets issuing from a rock near the highway. On the right hand, we saw several towns situated on rising grounds, and among the rest that of Assisio, famous for the birth of St. Francis, whose body, being here deposited, occasions a concourse of pilgrims. We met a Roman princess going thither with a grand retinue, in consequence of a vow she had made for the re-establishment of her health. Foligno, the Fulginium of the Antients, is a small town, not unpleasant, lying in the midst of mulberry plantations, vineyards, and cornfields, and built on both sides of the little river Topino. In choosing our beds at the inn, I perceived one chamber locked, and desired it might be opened, upon which the cameriere declared with some reluctance, bisogna dire su excellenza. Poco fa, ci una bestia e morta in questa camera, e non e ancora lustrata. Your Excellency must know that a filthy beast died lately in that chamber, and it is not yet purified and put in order. When I inquired what beast it was, he replied, un heretico Inglese, an English heretic. I suppose he would not have made so free with our country and religion if he had not taken us for German Catholics, as we afterwards learned from Mr. R. Roman 1. Next day we crossed the Tiber over a handsome bridge, and in mounting the steep hill upon which the city of Perugia stands, our horses being exhausted, were dragged backwards by the weight of the carriage to the very edge of a precipice, where, happily for us, a man passing that way placed a large stone behind one of the wheels, which stopped their motion, otherwise we should have been all dashed in pieces. We had another ugly hill to ascend within the city, which was more difficult and dangerous than the other. But the postilions and the other beasts made such efforts that we mounted without the least stop to the summit, where we found ourselves in a large piazza, where the horses are always changed. There being no relays at the post, we were obliged to stay the whole day and night at Perugia, which is a considerable city built upon the acclivity of a hill, adorned with some elegant fountains, and several handsome churches, containing some valuable pictures by Guido, Raphael, and his master Pietro Perugino, who was a native of this place. The next stage is on the banks of the lake, which was the Thrasymene of the Antients, a beautiful piece of water above 30 miles in circumference, having 3 islands abounding with excellent fish. Upon a peninsula of it there is a town and castle. It was in this neighbourhood where the consul Flaminius was totally defeated with great slaughter by Hannibal. From Perugia to Florence the posts are all double, and the road is so bad that we never could travel above 8 and 20 miles a day. We were often obliged to quit the carriage and walk up steep mountains, and the way in general was so unequal and stony that we were jolted even to the danger of our lives. I never felt any sort of exercise or fatigue so intolerable, and I did not fail to bestow 100 benedictions per diem upon the banker Barezzi, by whose advice we had taken this road. Yet there was no remedy but patience. If the coach had not been incredibly strong, it must have been shattered to pieces. The 5th night we passed at a place called Camaxia, a miserable cabaret, where we were fain to cook our own supper, and lay in a musty chamber which had never known a fire, and indeed had no fireplace, and where we ran the risque of being devoured by rats. Next day one of the irons of the coach gave way at Arezzo, where we were detained 2 hours before it could be accommodated. I might have taken this opportunity to view the remains of the antient Etruscan amphitheatre, and the temple of Hercules, described by the Cavalier Lorenzo Guazzesi, as standing in the neighbourhood of this place, but the blacksmith assured me his work would be finished in a few minutes, and as I had nothing so much at heart as the speedy accomplishment of this disagreeable journey, I chose to suppress my curiosity, rather than be the occasion of a moment's delay. But all the nights we had hitherto passed were comfortable in comparison to this, which we suffered at a small village, the name of which I do not remember. The house was dismal and dirty beyond all description, the bedclothes filthy enough to turn the stomach of a muleteer, and the victuals cooked in such a manner that even a Hottentot could not have beheld them without loathing. We had sheets of our own, which were spread upon a mattress, and here I took my repose wrapped in a greatcoat, if that could be called repose which was interrupted by the innumerable stings of vermin. In the morning I was seized with a dangerous fit of whooping cough, which terrified my wife, alarmed my people, and brought the whole community into the house. I had undergone just such another at Paris about a year before. This forenoon one of our coach wheels flew off in the neighbourhood of Ancissa, a small town where we were detained above 2 hours by this accident, a delay which was productive of much disappointment, danger, vexation, and fatigue. There being no horses at the last post, we were obliged to wait until those which brought us thither were sufficiently refreshed to proceed. Understanding that all the gates of Florence are shut at 6, except 2 that are kept open for the accommodation of travellers, and that to reach the nearest of these gates, it was necessary to pass the river Arno in a ferryboat, which could not transport the carriage, I determined to send my servant before with a light chaise to enter the nearest gate before it was shut, and provide a coach to come and take us up at the side of the river, where we should be obliged to pass. In the boat, for I could not bear the thoughts of lying another night in a common cabaret. Here, however, another difficulty occurred. There was but one chaise, and a dragoon officer in the imperial troops insisted upon his having bespoke it for himself and his servant. A long dispute ensued which had like to have produced a quarrel, but at length I accommodated matters by telling the officer that he should have a place in it gratis, and his servant might ride a horseback. He accepted the offer without hesitation, but in the meantime we set out in the coach before them, and having proceeded about a couple of miles, the road was so deep from a heavy rain, and the beasts were so fatigued that they could not proceed. The postillions scourging the poor animals with great barbarity, they made an effort, and pulled the coach to the brink of a precipice, or rather a kind of holloway, which might be about 7 or 8 feet lower than the road. Here my wife and I leaped out, and stood under the rain up to the ankles in mud. While the postillions still exercising their whips, one of the 4 horses fairly tumbled down the descent, Erod hung by the neck, so that he was almost strangled before he could be disengaged from the traces by the assistance of some foot travellers that happened to pass. While we remained in this dilemma, the chaise with the officer and my servant, coming up, we exchanged places. My wife and I proceeded in the chaise, and left them with Miss C and Mr R to follow in the coach. The road from hence to Florence is nothing but a succession of steep mountains, paved and conducted in such a manner that one would imagine the design had been to render it impracticable by any sort of wheel carriage. Notwithstanding all our endeavours, I found it would be impossible to enter Florence before the gates were shut. I flattered and threatened the driver by turns, but the fellow, who had been remarkably civil at first, grew sullen and impertinent. He told me I must not think of reaching Florence, that the boat would not take the carriage on board, and that from the other side I must walk 5 miles before I should reach the gate that was open. But he would carry me to an excellent osteria, where I should be entertained and lodged like a prince. I was now convinced that he had lingered on purpose to serve this innkeeper, and I took it for granted that what he told me of the distance between the ferry and the gate was a lie. It was 8 o'clock when we arrived at his inn. I alighted with my wife to view the chambers, desiring he would not put up his horses. Finding it was a villainous house, we came forth, and by this time the horses were put up. I asked the fellow how he durst presume to contradict my orders, and commanded him to put them to the chaise. He asked in his turn if I was mad, if I thought I and the lady had strength and courage enough to walk 5 miles in the dark, through a road which we did not know, and which was broke up by a continued rain of 2 days. I told him he was an impertinent rascal, and as he still hesitated, I collared him with one hand, and shook my cane over his head with the other. It was the only weapon I had, either offensive or defensive, for I had left my sword and musketoon in the coach. At length the fellow obeyed, though with great reluctance, cracking many severe jokes upon us in the meantime, and being joined in his raillery by the innkeeper, who had all the external marks of a ruffian. The house stood in a solitary situation, and not a soul appeared but these 2 miscreants, so that they might have murdered us without fear of detection. You do not like the apartments? Said one, to be sure they were not fitted up for persons of your rank and quality. You will be glad of a worse chamber. Continue the other before you get to bed. If you walk to Florence tonight, you will sleep so sound that the fleas will not disturb you. Take care you do not take up your night's lodging in the middle of the road, or in the ditch of the city wall. I fired inwardly at these sarcasms, to which, however, I made no reply, and my wife was almost dead with fear. In the road from hence to the boat, we met with an ill-looking fellow, who offered his service to conduct us into the city, and such was our situation, that I was fain to accept his proposal, especially as we had 2 small boxes in the chaise by accident, containing some caps and laces belonging to my wife. I still hoped the postillion had exaggerated in the distance between the boat and the city gate, and was confirmed in this opinion by the ferryman, who said we had not above league to walk. Behold us then in this expedition, myself wrapped up in a very heavy greatcoat and my cane in my hand. I did not imagine I could have walked a couple of miles in this equipage had my life been depending, my wife a delicate creature who had scarce ever walked a mile in her life, and the ragamuffin before us with our boxes under his arm. The night was dark and wet, the road slippery and dirty, not a soul was seen, nor a sound was heard, all was silent, dreary, and horrible. I laid my account with a violent fit of illness from the cold I should infallibly catch, if I escaped assassination, the fears of which were the more troublesome as I had no weapon to defend our lives. While I laboured under the weight of my greatcoat which made the streams of sweat flow down my face and shoulders, I was plunging in the mud, up to the mid-leg at every step, and at the same time obliged to support my wife, who wept in silence, half dead with terror and fatigue. To crown our vexation, our conductor walked so fast that he was often out of sight, and I imagined he had run away with the boxes. All I could do on these occasions was to hollow as loud as I could and swear horribly that I would blow his brains out. I did not know but these oaths and menaces might keep other rogues in awe. In this manner did we travel 3 long miles, making almost an entire circuit of the city wall, without seeing the face of a human creature, and at length reached the gate, where we were examined by the guard, and allowed to pass, after they had told us it was a long mile from thence to the house of Vanini, where we proposed to lodge. No matter, being now fairly within the city, I plucked up my spirits, and performed the rest of the journey with such ease that I am persuaded I could have walked at the same pace all night long, without being very much fatigued. It was near 10 at night, when we entered the auberge in such a draggled and miserable condition, that Mrs. Vanini almost fainted at sight of us, on the supposition that we had met with some terrible disaster, and that the rest of the company were killed. My wife and I were immediately accommodated with dry stockings and shoes, a warm apartment and a good supper, which I ate with great satisfaction, arising not only from our having happily survived the adventure, but also from a conviction that my strength and constitution were wonderfully repaired. Not but that I still expected a severe cold, attended with a terrible fit of the asthma, but in this I was luckily disappointed. I now for the first time drank to the health of my physician Baresi, fully persuaded that the hardships and violent exercise I underwent by following his advice had greatly contributed to the re-establishment of my health. In this particular, I imitate the gratitude of Tavernier, who was radically cured of the gout by a Turkish augur in Egypt, who gave him the bastinado, because he would not look at the head of the Bashor of Cairo, which the augur had in a bag, to be presented to the Grand Signior at Constantinople. I did not expect to see the rest of our company that night, as I never doubted but they would stay with the coach at the inn on the other side of the Arno, but at midnight we were joined by Miss C. and Mr. R., who had left the carriage at the inn under the auspices of the captain and my servant, and followed our footsteps by walking from the ferryboat to Florence, conducted by one of the boatmen. Mr. R. seemed to be much ruffled and chagrined, but as he did not think proper to explain the cause, he had no right to expect that I should give him satisfaction for some insult he had received from my servant. They had been exposed to a variety of disagreeable adventures from the impracticability of the road. The coach had been several times in the most imminent hazard of being lost with all our baggage, and at one place it was necessary to hire a dozen of oxen, and as many men to disengage it from the holes into which it had run. It was in the confusion of these adventures that the captain and his valet, Mr. R. and my servant, had like to have gone all by the ears together. The peace was with difficulty preserved by the interposition of Miss C., who suffered incredibly from cold and wet, terror, vexation, and fatigue, yet happily no bad consequence ensued. The coach and baggage were brought safely into Florence next morning, when all of us found ourselves well refreshed, and in good spirits. I am afraid this is not the case with you, who must by this time be quite jaded with this long epistle, which shall therefore be closed without further ceremony by yours always. Letter Roman 35. Nice, March 20, 1765. Dear Sir, the season being far advanced and the weather growing boisterous, I made but a short stay at Florence, and set out for Pisa, with full resolution to take the nearest road to Larissae, where we proposed to hire a felucca for Genoa. I had a great desire to see Leghorn and Lucca, but the dread of a winter's voyage by sea in an open boat effectually restrained my curiosity. To avoid the trouble of having our baggage shifted every post, I hired 2 chaises to Pisa for a couple of equines, and there we arrived in safety about 7 in the evening, though not without fear of the consequence, as the calices were quite open, and it rained all the way. I must own I was so sick of the wretched accommodation one meets within every part of Italy, except the great cities, so averse to the sea at this season, and so fond of the city of Pisa, that I should certainly have stayed here the winter, had not I been separated from my books and papers, as well as from other conveniencies and connections which I had at Nice, and foreseen that the thoughts of performing the same disagreeable voyage in the spring would embitter my whole winter's enjoyment. I again hired 2 calices for Larissae, proposing to lie at Sarzana, 3 miles short of that place, where we were told we should find comfortable lodging, and to embark next day without halting. When we departed in the morning, it rained very hard, and the Serchio, which the chaises had formerly passed, almost without wetting the wheels, was now swelled to a mighty river, broad and deep and rapid. It was with great difficulty I could persuade my wife to enter the boat, for it blew a storm, and she had seen it in coming over from the other side, hurried down a considerable way by the rapidity of the current, notwithstanding all the efforts of the watermen. Near 2 hours were spent in transporting us with our chaises. The road between this and Pietra Santa was rendered almost impassable. When we arrived at Massa, it began to grow dark, and the postmaster assured us that the road to Sarzana was overflowed in such a manner as not to be passed even in the daytime, without imminent danger. We therefore took up our lodging for the night at this house, which was in all respects one of the worst we had yet entered. Next day we found the Magra as large and violent as the Cercio. However, we passed it without any accident, and in the afternoon arrived at Lerasai. There we were immediately besieged by a number of patrons of feluccas, from among whom I chose a Spaniard, partly because he looked like an honest man, and produced an ample certificate, signed by an English gentleman, and partly because he was not an Italian, for by this time I had imbibed a strong prejudice against the common people of that country. We embarked in the morning before day, with a gale that made us run the Liegenwale in the water. But when we pretended to turn the point of Porto Venner, we found the wind full in our teeth, and were obliged to return to our quarters, where we had been shamefully fleeced by the landlord, who nevertheless was not such an exorbitant knave as the postmaster, whose house I would advise all travellers to avoid. Here indeed I had occasion to see an instance of prudence and economy, which I should certainly imitate, if ever I had occasion to travel this way by myself. An Englishman who had hired a felucca from Antibes to Leghorn was put in here by stress of weather, but being aware of the extortion of innkeepers, and the bad accommodation in their houses, he slept on board on his own mattresses, and there likewise he had all his conveniencies for eating. He sent his servant on shore occasionally to buy provision, and see it cooked according to his direction in some public house, and had his meals regularly in the felucca. This evening he came ashore to stretch his legs, and took a solitary walk on the beach, avoiding us with great care, although he knew we were English. His valet, who was abundantly communicative, told my servant that in coming through France his master had travelled 3 days in company with 2 other English gentlemen whom he met upon the road, and in all that time he never spoke a word to either, yet in other respects he was a good man, mild, charitable, and humane. This is a character truly British. At 5 o'clock in the morning we put to sea again, and though the wind was contrary, made shift to reach the town of Sestri di Levante, where we were most graciously received by the publican butcher and his family. The house was in much better order than before, the people were much more obliging. We passed a very tolerable night, and had a very reasonable bill to pay in the morning. I cannot account for this favourable change any other way than by ascribing it to the effects of a terrible storm, which had 2 days before torn up a great number of their olivet trees by the roots, and done such damage as terrified them into humility and submission. Next day, the water being delightful, we arrived by 1 o'clock in the afternoon at Genoa. Here I made another bargain with our patron Antonio to carry us to Nice. He had been hitherto remarkably obliging and seemingly modest. He spoke Latin fluently and was tinctured with the sciences. I began to imagine he was a person of a good family, who had met with misfortunes in life and respected him accordingly. But I afterwards found him mercenary, mean, and rapacious. The wind being still contrary when we departed from Genoa, we could get no further than Finale, where we lodged in a very dismal habitation, which was recommended to us as the best auberge in the place. What rendered it the more uncomfortable, the night was cold, and there was not a fireplace in the house except in the kitchen. The beds, if they deserved that name, were so shockingly nasty that we could not have used them, had not a friend of Mr. R supplied us with mattresses, sheets, and coverlets, for our own sheets were on board the felucca, which was anchored at a distance from the shore. Our fare was equally wretched. The master of the house was a surly assassin, and his cameriere or waiter stark staring mad. Our situation was at the same time shocking and ridiculous. Mr. R quarrelled overnight with the master, who swore in broken French to my man that he had a good mind to poniard that impertinent Piedmontese. In the morning, before day, Mr. R, coming into my chamber, gave me to understand that he had been insulted by the landlord, who demanded 36 livres for our supper and lodging. Incensed at the rascal's presumption, I assured him I would make him take half the money, and a good beating into the bargain. He replied that he would have saved me the trouble of beating him, had not the cameriere, who was a very sensible fellow, assured him the padrone was out of his senses, and if roughly handled might commit some extravagance. Though I was exceedingly ruffled, I could not help laughing at the mad Camerière's palming himself upon Rye as a sensible fellow, and transferring the charge of madness upon his master, who seemed to be much more knave than fool. While Mr. R. went to mass, I desired the Camerière to bid his master bring the bill, and to tell him that if it was not reasonable, I would carry him before the commandant. In the meantime I armed myself with my sword in one hand and my cane in the other. The innkeeper immediately entered, pale and staring, and when I demanded his bill he told me, with a profound reverence, that he should be satisfied with whatever I myself thought proper to give. Surprised at this moderation, I asked if he should be content with 12 livres, and he answered contentissimo with another prostration. Then he made an apology for the bad accommodation of his house, and complained that the reproaches of the other gentleman, whom he was pleased to call my maggior duomo, had almost turned his brain. When he quitted the room, his Camerière, laying hold of his master's last words, pointed to his own forehead, and said he had informed the gentleman overnight that his patron was mad. This day we were by a high wind in the afternoon, driven for shelter into Porto Mauritio, where we found the post-house even worse than that of Finale, and what rendered it more shocking was a girl quite covered with the confluent smallpox, who lay in a room through which it was necessary to pass to the other chambers, and who smelled so strong as to perfume the whole house. We were but 15 miles from St. Remo, where I knew the auberge was tolerable, and thither I resolved to travel by land. I accordingly ordered 5 mules to travel post, and a very ridiculous cavalcade we formed, the women being obliged to use common saddles, for in this country even the ladies sit astride. The road lay along one continued precipice, and was so difficult that the beasts never could exceed a walking pace. In some places we were obliged to alight. 7 hours were spent in travelling 15 short miles. At length we arrived at our old lodgings in St. Remo, which we found whitewashed and in great order. We supped pretty comfortably, slept well, and had no reason to complain of imposition in paying the bill. This was not the case in the article of the mules, for which I was obliged to pay 50 livres, according to the regulation of the posts. The postmaster who came along with us had the effrontery to tell me that if I had hired the mules to carry me and my company to St. Remo, in the way of common travelling, they would have cost me but 15 livres, but as I demanded post-horses, I must submit to the regulations. This is a distinction the more absurd, as the road is of such a nature as renders it impossible to travel faster in one way than in another, nor indeed is there the least difference either in the carriage or convenience between travelling post and journey riding. A publican might with the same reason charge me 3 livres a pound for whiting, and if questioned about the imposition reply, that if I had asked for fish I should have had the same whiting for the 5th part of the money, but that he made a wide difference between selling it as fish and selling it as whiting. Our felucca came round from Porto Mauritio in the night, and embarking next morning, we arrived at Nice about 4 in the afternoon. Thus have I given you a circumstantial detail of my Italian expedition, during which I was exposed to a great number of hardships, which I thought my weakened constitution could not have bore, as well as to violent fits of passion, checkered, however, with transports of a more agreeable nature, insomuch that I may say I was for 2 months continually agitated either in mind or body, and very often in both at the same time. As my disorder at first arose from a sedentary life, producing a relaxation of the fibres, which naturally brought on a listlessness, indolence, and dejection of the spirits, I am convinced that this hard exercise of mind and body co-operated with the change of air and objects to brace up the relaxed constitution and promote a more vigorous circulation of the juices, which had long languished even almost to stagnation. For some years, I had been as subject to colds as a delicate woman new delivered. If I ventured to go abroad when there was the least moisture either in the air or upon the ground, I was sure to be laid up a fortnight with a cough and asthma. But in this journey I suffered cold and rain, and stood and walked in the wet, heated myself with exercise, and sweated violently without feeling the least disorder, but on the contrary felt myself growing stronger every day in the midst of these excesses. Since my return to Nice, it has rained the best part of 2 months, to the astonishment of all the people in the country, yet during all that time I have enjoyed good health and spirits. On Christmas Eve I went to the cathedral at midnight, to hear high mass celebrated by the new Bishop of Nice in pontificalibus, and stood near 2 hours uncovered in a cold gallery, without having any cause in the sequel to repent of my curiosity. In a word, I am now so well that I no longer despair of seeing you and the rest of my friends in England. a pleasure which is eagerly desired by, dear sir, your affectionate humble servant. Letter Roman 36. Nice, March 23, 1766. Dear sir, you ask whether I think the French people are more taxed than the English, but I apprehend the question would be more apropos if you asked whether the French taxes are more insupportable than the English, for in comparing burthens, we ought always to consider the strength of the shoulders that bear them. I know no better way of estimating the strength than by examining the face of the country and observing the appearance of the common people, who constitute the bulk of every nation. When I therefore see the country of England smiling with cultivation, the grounds exhibiting all the perfection of agriculture, parcelled out into beautiful enclosures, cornfields, hay and pasture, woodland and common, when I see her meadows well stocked with black cattle, her downs covered with sheep, when I view her teams of horses and oxen, large and strong, fat and sleek, when I see her farmhouses the habitations of plenty, cleanliness and convenience, and her peasants well fed, well lodged, well clothed, tall and stout, and hale and jolly, I cannot help concluding that the people are well able to bear those impositions which the public necessities have rendered necessary. On the other hand, when I perceive such signs of poverty, misery and dirt, among the commonalty of France, their unfenced fields dug up in despair, without the intervention of meadow or fallow ground, without cattle to furnish manure, without horses to execute the plans of agriculture, their farmhouses mean, their furniture wretched, their apparel beggarly, themselves and their beasts the images of famine, I cannot help thinking they groan under oppression, either from their landlords or their government, probably from both. The principal impositions of the French government are these: first, the taille paid by all the commons except those that are privileged; secondly, the capitation, from which no persons, not even the nobles, are excepted; thirdly, the tenths and twentieths, called dixums and vingtimes, which every body pays. This tax was originally levied as an occasional aid in times of war and other emergencies, but by degrees is become a standing revenue even in time of peace. All the money arising from these impositions goes directly to the king's treasury, and must undoubtedly amount to a very great sum. Besides these, he has the revenue of the farms, consisting of the droits-dides, or excise on wine, brandy, 100; of the custom-house duties; of the gabelle, comprehending that most oppressive obligation on individuals to take a certain quantity of salt at the price which the farmers shall please to fix; of the exclusive privilege to sell tobacco; of the droits de contrôle, insinuation, centime denier, franchifs, orbine, échange et contrechange arising from the acts of voluntary jurisdiction, as well as certain lawsuits. These farms are said to bring into the king's coffers above 120 millions of livres yearly, amounting to near 5 millions sterling. But the poor people are said to pay about a third more than this sum, which the farmers retain to enrich themselves, and bribe the great for their protection, which protection of the great is the true reason why this most iniquitous, oppressive, and absurd method of levying money is not laid aside. Over and above those articles I have mentioned, the French king draws considerable sums from his clergy, under the denomination of dons gratuits or free gifts, as well as from the subsidies given by the pays d'etats such as Provence, Languedoc, and Bretagne, which are exempted from the taille. The whole revenue of the French king amounts to between 12 and 13 millions sterling. These are great resources for the king, but they will always keep the people miserable, and effectually prevent them from making such improvements as might turn their lands to the best advantage. But besides being eased in the article of taxes, there is something else required to make them exert themselves for the benefit of their country. They must be free in their persons, secure in their property, indulged with reasonable leases, and effectually protected by law from the insolence and oppression of their superiors. Great as the French king's resources may appear, they are hardly sufficient to defray the enormous expense of his government. About 2 millions sterling per annum of his revenue are said to be anticipated for paying the interest of the public debts, and the rest is found inadequate to the charge of a prodigious standing army, a double frontier of fortified towns, and the extravagant appointments of ambassadors, generals, governors, intendants, commandants, and other officers of the crown, all of whom affect a pomp which is equally ridiculous and prodigal. A French general in the field is always attended by 30 or 40 cooks, and thinks it is incumbent upon him, for the glory of France, to give 100 dishes every day at his table. When Don Philip and the Marechal Duc de Belleisle had their quarters at Nice, there were 50 scullions constantly employed in the great square in plucking poultry. This absurd luxury infects their whole army. Even the commissaries keep open table, and nothing is seen but prodigality and profusion. The King of Sardinia proceeds upon another plan. His troops are better clothed, better paid, and better fed than those of France. The commandant of Nice has about 400 a year of appointments, which enable him to live decently, and even to entertain strangers. On the other hand, the commandant of Antibes, which is in all respects more inconsiderable than Nice, has from the French king above 5 times the sum to support the glory of his monarch, which all the sensible part of mankind treat with ridicule and contempt. But the finances of France are so ill managed that many of their commandants and other officers have not been able to draw their appointments these 2 years. In vain they complain and remonstrate. When they grow troublesome they are removed. How then must they support the glory of France? How but by oppressing the poor people? The treasurer makes use of their money for his own benefit. The king knows it. He knows his officers, thus defrauded, fleece and oppress his people, but he thinks proper to wink at these abuses. That government may be said to be weak and tottering, which finds itself obliged to connive at such proceedings. The King of France, in order to give strength and stability to his administration, ought to have sense to adopt a sage plan of economy, and vigour of mind sufficient to execute it in all its parts, with the most rigorous exactness. He ought to have courage enough to find fault, and even to punish the delinquents, of what quality soever they may be, and the first act of reformation ought to be a total abolition of all the farms. There are undoubtedly many marks of relaxation in the reins of the French government, and in all probability the subjects of France will be the first to take advantage of it. There is at present a violent fermentation of different principles among them, which under the reign of a very weak prince, or during a long minority, may produce a great change in the constitution. In proportion to the progress of reason and philosophy, which have made great advances in this kingdom, superstition loses ground, antient prejudices give way, a spirit of freedom takes the ascendant. All the learned laity of France detest the hierarchy as a plan of despotism, founded on imposture and usurpation. The Protestants, who are very numerous in southern parts, abhor it with all the rancour of religious fanaticism. Many of the commons, enriched by commerce and manufacture, grow impatient of those odious distinctions, which exclude them from the honours and privileges due to their importance in the commonwealth, and all the parliaments or tribunals of justice in the kingdom seem bent upon asserting their rights and independence in the face of the king's prerogative, and even at the expense of his power and authority. Should any prince therefore be seduced by evil counsellors, or misled by his own bigotry, to take some arbitrary step that may be extremely disagreeable to all those communities, without having spirit to exert the violence of his power for the support of his measures, he will become equally detested and despised, and the influence of the commons will insensibly encroach upon the pretensions of the crown. But if in the time of a minority, the power of the government should be divided among different competitors for the regency, the parliaments and people will find it still more easy to acquire and ascertain the liberty at which they aspire, because they will have the balance of power in their hands, and be able to make either scale preponderate. I could say a great deal more upon this subject, and I have some remarks to make relating to the methods which might be taken in the case of a fresh rupture with France, for making a vigorous impression on that kingdom. But these I in list defer till another occasion, having neither room nor leisure at present to add anything, but that I am with great truth, dear sir, your very humble servant. Letter Roman 37, Nice, April 2, 1765. Dear Doctor, as I have now passed a second winter at Nice, I think myself qualified to make some further remarks on this climate. During the heats of last summer, I flattered myself with the prospect of the fine weather I should enjoy in the winter, but neither I nor any person in this country could foresee the rainy weather that prevailed from the middle of November till the 20th of March. In this short period of 4 months, we have had 56 days of rain, which I take to be a greater quantity than generally falls during the 6 worst months of the year in the county of Middlesex, especially as it was, for the most part, a heavy, continued rain. The south winds generally predominate in the wet season at Nice, but this winter the rain was accompanied with every wind that blows, except the south, though the most frequent were those that came from the east and north quarters. Notwithstanding these great rains, such as were never known before at Nice in the memory of man, the intermediate days of fair weather were delightful, and the ground seemed perfectly dry. The air itself was perfectly free from moisture. Though I live upon a ground floor, surrounded on 3 sides by a garden, I could not perceive the least damp, either on the floors or the furniture. Neither was I much incommoded by the asthma, which used always to harass me most in wet weather. In a word, I passed the winter here much more comfortably than I expected. About the vernal equinox, however, I caught a violent cold, which was attended with a difficulty of breathing, and as the sun advances towards the tropic, I find myself still more subject to rheums. As the heat increases, the humours of the body are rarefied, and of consequence the pores of the skin are opened, while the east wind sweeping over the Alps and Apennines, covered with snow, continues surprisingly sharp and penetrating. Even the people of the country, who enjoy good health, are afraid of exposing themselves to the air at this season, the intemperature of which may last till the middle of May, when all the snow on the mountains will probably be melted. Then the air will become mild and balmy, till in the progress of summer it grows disagreeably hot, and the strong evaporation from the sea makes it so saline as to be unhealthy for those who have a scorbutical habit. When the sea breeze is high, this evaporation is so great as to cover the surface of the body with a kind of volatile brine, as I plainly perceived last summer. I am more and more convinced that this climate is unfavourable for the scurvy. Were I obliged to pass my life in it, I would endeavour to find a country retreat among the mountains, at some distance from the sea, where I might enjoy a cool air, free from this impregnation, unmolested by those flies, gnats, and other vermin which render the lower parts almost uninhabitable. To this place I would retire in the month of June, and there continue till the beginning of October, when I would return to my habitation in Nice, where the winter is remarkably mild and agreeable. In March and April, however, I would not advise a valetudinarian to go forth, without taking precaution against the cold. An agreeable summer retreat may be found on the other side of the Var, at or near the town of Grasse, which is pleasantly situated on the ascent of a hill in Provence, about 7 English miles from Nice. This place is famous for its pomatum, gloves, washballs, perfumes, and toilette boxes, lined with bergamot. I am told it affords good lodging, and is well supplied with provisions. We are now preparing for our journey to England, from the exercise of which I promise myself much benefit. A journey extremely agreeable, not only on that account, but also because it will restore me to the company of my friends, and remove me from a place where I leave nothing but the air which I can possibly regret. The only friendships I have contracted at Nice are with strangers, who, like myself, only sojourn here for a season. I now find by experience it is great folly to buy furniture, unless one is resolved to settle here for some years. The Nissards assured me, with great confidence, that I should always be able to sell it for a very little loss, whereas I find myself obliged to part with it for about 1/3 of what it cost. I have sent for a coach to Aix, and as soon as it arrives shall take my departure, so that the next letter you receive from me will be dated at some place on the road. I purpose to take Antibes, Toulon, Marseille, Aix, Avignon, and Orange in my way, places which I have not yet seen, and where perhaps I shall find something for your amusement, which will always be a consideration of some weight with, dear sir, yours. Letter Roman 38. To Dr. S. at Nice. Turin, March 18, 1765. Dear sir, Turin is about 30 leagues from Nice, the greater part of the way lying over frightful mountains covered with snow. The difficulty of the road, however, reaches no farther than Conai, from whence there is an open highway through a fine plain country as far as the capital of Piedmont, and the traveller is accommodated with chaises and horses to proceed either post or by cambiatura, as in other parts of Italy. There are only 2 ways of performing the journey over the mountains from Nice. One is to ride a muleback, and the other to be carried in a chair. The former I chose, and set out with my servant on the 7th day of February at 2 in the afternoon. I was hardly clear of Nice, when it began to rain so hard that in less than an hour the mud was half a foot deep in many parts of the road. This was the only inconvenience we suffered, the way being in other respects practicable enough, for there is but one small hill to cross on this side of the village of El Esquern, where we arrived about 6 in the evening. The ground in this neighbourhood is tolerably cultivated, and the mountains are planted to the tops with olive trees. The accommodation here is so very bad, that I had no inclination to be abed longer than was absolutely necessary for refreshment, and therefore I proceeded on my journey at 2 in the morning, conducted by a guide, whom I hired for this purpose at the rate of 3 livres a day. Having ascended one side and descended the other of the mountain called Brous, which took up 4 hours, though the road is not bad, we at 6 reached the village of Sospello, which is agreeably situated in a small valley, surrounded by prodigious high and barren mountains. This little plain is pretty fertile, and being watered by a pleasant stream, forms a delightful contrast with the hideous rocks that surround it. Having reposed myself and my mules 2 hours at this place, we continued our journey over the second mountain, called Bravis, which is rather more considerable than the first, and in 4 hours arrived at L'Argendola, a tolerable inn situated betwixt the high road and a small river, about a gunshot from the town of Brigli, which we leave on the right. As we jogged along in the grey of the morning, I was a little startled at 2 figures which I saw before me, and began to put my pistols in order. It must be observed that these mountains are infested with contrabandiers, a set of smuggling peasants, very bold and desperate, who make a traffic of selling tobacco, salt, and other merchandise, which have not paid duty, and sometimes lay travellers under contribution. I did not doubt but there was a gang of these freebooters at hand, but as no more than 2 persons appeared, I resolved to let them know we were prepared for defence, and fired one of my pistols, in hope that the report of it, echoed from the surrounding rocks, would produce a proper effect. But the mountains and roads being entirely covered with snow to a considerable depth, there was little or no reverberation, and the sound was not louder than that of a popgun, although the piece contained a good charge of powder. Nevertheless, it did not fail to engage the attention of the strangers, one of whom immediately wheeled to the left about, and being by this time very near me, gave me an opportunity of contemplating his whole person. He was very tall, meagre, and yellow, with a long hooked nose and small twinkling eyes. His head was eased in a woolen nightcap, over which he wore a flapped hat. He had a silk handkerchief about his neck, and his mouth was furnished with a short wooden pipe, from which he discharged wreathing clouds of tobacco smoke. He was wrapped in a kind of cap out of green baize, lined with wolfskin, had a pair of monstrous boots, quilted on the inside with cotton, was almost covered with dirt, and rode a mule so low that his long legs hung dangling within 6 inches of the ground. This grotesque figure was so much more ludicrous than terrible that I could not help laughing, when, taking his pipe out of his mouth, he very politely accosted me by name. You may easily guess I was exceedingly surprised at such an address on the top of the mountain Bravis, but he forthwith put an end to it too, by discovering himself to be the Marquis M., whom I had the honour to be acquainted with at Nice. After having rallied him upon his equipage, he gave me to understand he had set out from Nice the morning of the same day that I departed, that he was going to Turin, and that he had sent one of his servants before him to Coney with his baggage. Knowing him to be an agreeable companion, I was glad of this encounter, and we resolved to travel the rest of the way together. We dined at L'Argendola, and in the afternoon rode along the little river Roida, which runs in a bottom between frightful precipices, and in several places forms natural cascades, the noise of which had well nigh deprived us of the sense of hearing. After winding course among these mountains, it discharges itself into the Mediterranean at Ventimiglia, in the territory of Genoa. As the snow did not lie on these mountains, when we cracked our whips, there was such a repercussion of the sound as is altogether inconceivable. We passed by the village of Seorgio, situated on an eminence where there is a small fortress which commands the whole pass, and in 5 hours arrived at our inn on this side the Col de Tende, where we took up our quarters, but had very little reason to boast of our entertainment. Our greatest difficulty, however, consisted in pulling off the Marquis's boots, which were of the kind called ceferat, by this time so loaded with dirt on the outside, and so swelled with the rain within, that he could neither drag them after him as he walked, nor disencumber his legs of them, without such violence as seemed almost sufficient to tear him limb from limb. In a word, we were obliged to tie a rope about his heel, and all the people in the house assisting to pull, the poor Marquis was drawn from one end of the apartment to the other before the boot would give way. At last his legs were happily disengaged, and the machines carefully dried and stuffed for next day's journey. We took our departure from hence at 3 in the morning, and at 4 began to mount the Col de Tende, which is by far the highest mountain in the whole journey. It was now quite covered with snow, which at the top of it was near 20 feet thick. Halfway up there are quarters for a detachment of soldiers, posted here to prevent smuggling, and an inn called la Car, which in the language of the country signifies the house. At this place we hired 6 men to assist us in ascending the mountain, each of them provided with a kind of hoe to break the ice, and make a sort of steps for the mules. When we were near the top, however, we were obliged to alight, and climb the mountain supported each by 2 of those men, called coulants, who walk upon the snow with great firmness and security. We were followed by the mules, and though they are very sure-footed animals, and were frost-shod for the occasion, they stumbled and fell very often, the ice being so hard that the sharp-edged nails in their shoes could not penetrate. Having reached the top of this mountain, from whence there is no prospect but of other rocks and mountains, we prepared for descending on the other side by the lees, which is an occasional sledge made of 2 pieces of wood, carried up by the coulants for this purpose. I did not much relish this kind of carriage, especially as the mountain was very steep, and covered with such a thick fog that we could hardly see 2 or 3 yards before us. Nevertheless, our guides were so confident, and my companion, who had passed the same way on other occasions, was so secure, that I ventured to place myself on this machine, one of the coulants standing behind me, and the other sitting before as the conductor, with his feet paddling among the snow, in order to moderate the velocity of its descent. Thus accommodated, we descended the mountain with such rapidity, that in an hour we reached Limon, which is the native place of almost all the muleteers who transport merchandise from Nice to Conai and Turin. Here we waited full 2 hours for the mules, which travelled with the servants by the common road. To each of the coulants we paid 40 sols, which are nearly equal to 2 shillings sterling. Leaving Limon, we were in 2 hours quite disengaged from the gorges of the mountains, which are partly covered with wood and pasturage, though altogether inaccessible, except in summer. But from the foot of the Col de Tende, the road lies through a plain all the way to Turin. We took 6 hours to travel from the inn where we had lodged over the mountain to Limon, and 5 hours from thence to Conai. Here we found our baggage, which we had sent off by the carriers one day before we departed from Nice, and here we dismissed our guides together with the mules. In winter you have a mule for this whole journey at the rate of 20 livres, and the guides are paid at the rate of 2 livres a day, reckoning 6 days, 3 for the journey to Conai, and 3 for their return to Nice. We set out so early in the morning in order to avoid the inconveniencies and dangers that attend the passage of this mountain. The first of these arises from your meeting with long strings of loaded mules in a slippery road, the breadth of which does not exceed 1.5 feet. As it is altogether impossible for 2 mules to pass each other in such a narrow path, the muleteers have made doublings or elbows in different parts, and when the troops of mules meet, the least numerous is obliged to turn off into one of these doublings, and there halt until the others are passed. Travellers, in order to avoid this disagreeable delay, which is the more vexatious, considering the excessive cold, begin the ascent of the mountain early in the morning before the mules quit their inns. But the great danger of travelling here when the sun is up proceeds from what they call the valanches. These are balls of snow detached from the mountains which overtop the road, either by the heat of the sun or the humidity of the weather. A piece of snow thus loosened from the rock, though perhaps not above 3 or 4 feet in diameter, increases sometimes in its descent to such a degree as to become 200 paces in length, and rolls down with such rapidity that the traveller is crushed to death before he can make 3 steps on the road. These dreadful heaps drag everything along with them in their descent. They tear up huge trees by the roots, and if they chance to fall upon a house, demolish it to the foundation. Accidents of this nature seldom happen in the winter while the weather is dry, and yet scarce a year passes in which some mules and their drivers do not perish by the valanches. At Conai we found the Countess C. from Nice, who had made the same journey in a chair, carried by porters. This is no other than a common elbow chair of wood, with a straw bottom, covered above with waxed cloth, to protect the traveller from the rain or snow, and provided with a footboard upon which the feet rest. It is carried like a sedan chair, and for this purpose 6 or 8 porters are employed at the rate of 3 or 4 livres a head per day, according to the season, allowing 3 days for their return. Of these 6 men, 2 are between the poles carrying like common chairmen, and each of these is supported by the other 2, 1 at each hand, but as those in the middle sustain the greatest burthen, they are relieved by the others in a regular rotation. In descending the mountain, they carry the poles on their shoulders, and in that case 4 men are employed, 1 at each end. At Conai you may have a chaise to go with the same horses to Turin, for which you pay 15 livres, and are a day and a half on the way. You may post it, however, in 1 day, and then the price is 7 livres 10 sols per post, and 10 sols to the postillion. The method we took was that of cambiatura. This is a chaise with horses shifted at the same stages that are used in posting, but as it is supposed to move slower, we pay but 5 livres per post, and 10 sols to the postillion. In order to quicken its pace, we gave 10 sols extraordinary to each postillion, and for this gratification he drove us even faster than the post. The chaises are like those of Italy, and will take on near 200 weight of baggage. Conai is situated between 2 small streams, and though neither very large nor populous, is considerable for the strength of its fortifications. It is honoured with the title of the Maiden Fortress, because though several times besieged, it was never taken. The Prince of Conti invested it in the War of 1744, but he was obliged to raise the siege after having given battle to the King of Sardinia. The place was gallantly defended by the Baron Lutram, a German Protestant, the best general in the Sardinian service, but what contributed most to the miscarriage of the enemy was a long tract of heavy rains, which destroyed all their works and rendered their advances impracticable. I need not tell you that Piedmont is one of the most fertile and agreeable countries in Europe, and this the most agreeable part of all Piedmont, though it now appeared to disadvantage from the rigorous season of the year. I shall only observe that we passed through Sabellion, which is a considerable town, and arrived in the evening at Turin. We entered this fine city by the gate of Nice, and passing through the elegant Piazza di San Carlo, took up our quarters at the Bona Fama, which stands at one corner of the great square, called La Piazza Castel. Were I even disposed to give a description of Turin, I should be obliged to postpone it till another opportunity, having no room at present to say anything more, but that I am always yours. Letter Roman 39. Aix-en-Provence, May 10, 1765. Dear Sir, I am thus far on my way to England. I had resolved to leave Nice without having the least dispute with any one native of the place, but I found it impossible to keep this resolution. My landlord, Mr. C., a man of fashion, with whose family we had always lived in friendship, was so reasonable as to expect I should give him up the house and garden, though they were to be paid for till Michaelmas, and peremptorily declared I should not be permitted to sublet them to any other person. He had of his own accord assured me more than once that he would take my furniture off my hands, and trusting to this assurance, I had lost the opportunity of disposing it to advantage. But when the time of my departure drew near, he refused to take it, at the same time insisting upon having the key of the house and garden, as well as on being paid the whole rent directly, though it would not be due till the middle of September. I was so exasperated at this treatment from a man whom I had cultivated with particular respect, that I determined to contest it at law, but the affair was accommodated by the mediation of a father of the Minims, a friend to both, and a merchant of Nice, who charged himself with the care of the house and furniture. A stranger must conduct himself with the utmost circumspection to be able to live among these people without being the dupe of imposition. I had sent to Aix for a coach and 4 horses, which I hired at the rate of 18 French livres a day, being equal to 15 shillings and 9 sterling. The river Var was so swelled by the melting of the snow on the mountains as to be impassable by any wheel carriage, and therefore the coach remained at Antibes, to which we went by water, the distance being about 9 or 10 miles. This is the Antipolis of the Antients, said to have been built like Nice by a colony from Marseille. In all probability, however, it was later than the foundation of Nice, and took its name from its being situated directly opposite to that city. Pliny says it was famous for its tuna fishery, and to this circumstance Martial alludes in the following lines. Antipolitani fater sum filia thini, essum si scambri non tibi missa form. I am spawned from Tunny of Antibes, 'tis true. Right scammer had I been, I ne'er had come to you. The famous pickle garum was made from the thinnis or tunny as well as from the scammer, but that from the scammer was counted the most delicate. Commentators, however, are not agreed about the scammer or scambris. Some suppose it was the herring or sprat, others believe it was the mackerel. After all, perhaps it was the anchovy, which I do not find distinguished by any other Latin name, for the encrassicolus is a Greek appellation altogether generical. Those who would be further informed about the garum and the scammer may consult Caelius Apicius de Recogniaria, cum notis variorum. At present, Antibes is the frontier of France towards Italy, pretty strongly fortified, and garrisoned by a battalion of soldiers. The town is small and inconsiderable, but the basin of the harbour is surrounded to seaward by a curious bulwark founded upon piles driven in the water, consisting of a wall, ramparts, casemates, and quay. Vessels lie very safe in this harbour, but there is not water at the entrance of it to admit of ships of any burthen. The shallows run so far off from the coast that a ship of force cannot lie near enough to batter the town, but it was bombarded in the late war. Its chief strength by land consists in a small quadrangular fort detached from the body of the place, which in a particular manner commands the entrance of the harbour. The wall of the town built in the sea has embrasures and salient angles, on which a great number of cannon may be mounted. I think the adjacent country is much more pleasant than that on the side of Nice, and there is certainly no essential difference in the climate. The ground here is not so encumbered, it is laid out in agreeable enclosures with intervals of open fields, and the mountains rise with an easy ascent at a much greater distance from the sea than on the other side of the bay. Besides, here are charming rides along the beach, which is smooth and firm. When we passed in the last week of April, the corn was in the ear, the cherries were almost ripe, and the figs had begun to blacken. I had embarked my heavy baggage on board a London ship, which happened to be at Nice, ready to sail. As for our small trunks or portmanteaus which we carried along with us, they were examined at Antibes, but the ceremony was performed very superficially, in consequence of tipping the searcher with half a crown, which is a wonderful conciliator at all the bureaus in this country. We lay at Cannes, a neat village, charmingly situated on the beach of the Mediterranean, exactly opposite to the Isles Marguerites where state prisoners are confined. As there are some good houses in this place, I would rather live here for the sake of the mild climate than either at Antibes or Nice. Here you are not cooped up within walls, nor crowded with soldiers and people, but are already in the country, enjoy a fine air, and are well supplied with all sorts of fish. The mountains of Esterelles, which in one of my former letters I described as a most romantic and noble plantation of evergreens, trees, shrubs, and aromatic plants, is at present quite desolate. Last summer, some execrable villains set fire to the pines, when the wind was high. It continued burning for several months, and the conflagration extended above 10 leagues, consuming an incredible quantity of timber. The ground is now naked on each side of the road, or occupied by the black trunks of the trees, which have been scorched without falling. They stand as so many monuments of the judgment of heaven, filling the mind with horror and compassion. I could hardly refrain from shedding tears at this dismal spectacle, when I recalled the idea of what it was about 18 months ago. As we stayed all night at Fréjus, I had an opportunity of viewing the amphitheatre at leisure. As near as I can judge by the eye, it is of the same dimensions with that of Nismes, but shockingly dilapidated. The stone seats rising from the arena are still extant, and the cells under them where the wild beasts were kept. There are likewise the remains of 2 galleries one over another, and 2 vomitoria or great gateways at opposite sides of the arena, which is now a fine green, with a road through the middle of it. But all the external architecture and the ornaments are demolished. The most entire part of the wall now constitutes part of a monastery, the monks of which, I am told, have helped to destroy the amphitheatre by removing the stones for their own purposes of building. In the neighbourhood of this amphitheatre, which stands without the walls, are the vestiges of an old edifice, said to have been the palace where the imperator or president resided, for it was a Roman colony, much favoured by Julius Caesar, who gave it the name of Forum Julii and Civitas Fora Juliensis. In all probability, it was he who built the amphitheatre, and brought hither the water 10 leagues from the river of Cyagni, by means of an aqueduct, some arcades of which are still standing on the other side of the town. A great number of statues were found in this place, together with antient inscriptions, which have been published by different authors. I need not tell you that Julius Agricola, the father-in-law of Tacitus the historian, was a native of Fréjus, which is now a very poor inconsiderable place. From hence the country opens to the left, forming an extensive plain between the sea and the mountains, which are a continuation of the Alps, that stretches through Provence and Dauphine. This plain, watered with pleasant streams, and varied with vineyards, cornfields, and meadow ground, afforded a most agreeable prospect to our eyes, which were accustomed to the sight of scorching sands, rugged rocks, and abrupt mountains in the neighbourhood of Nice. Although this has much the appearance of a corn country, I am told it does not produce enough for the consumption of its inhabitants, who are obliged to have annual supplies from abroad, imported at Marseille. A Frenchman, at an average, eats 3 times the quantity of bread that satisfies a native of England, and indeed it is undoubtedly the staff of his life. I am therefore surprised that the Provencaux do not convert part of their vineyards into cornfields, for they may boast of their wine as they please, but that which is drank by the common people, not only here, but also in all the wine countries of France, is neither so strong, nourishing, nor in my opinion so pleasant to the taste as the small beer of England. It must be owned that all the peasants who have wine for their ordinary drink are of a diminutive size, in comparison of those who use milk, beer, or even water. And it is a constant observation that when there is a scarcity of wine, the common people are always more healthy than in those seasons when it abounds. The longer I live, the more I am convinced that wine and all fermented liquors are pernicious to the human constitution, and that for the preservation of health and exhilaration of the spirits, there is no beverage comparable to simple water. Between Luc and Toulon, the country is delightfully parcelled out into enclosures. Here is plenty of rich pasturage for black cattle, and a greater number of pure streams and rivulets than I have observed in any other parts of France. Toulon is a considerable place, even exclusive of the basin, docks, and arsenal, which indeed are such as justify the remark made by a stranger when he viewed them. The King of France said he is greater at Toulon than at Versailles. The quay, the jetties, the docks, and magazines are contrived and executed with precision, order, solidity, and magnificence. I counted 14 ships of the line lying unrigged in the basin, besides the tonnant of 80 guns, which was in dock repairing, and a new frigate on the stocks. I was credibly informed that in the last war, the King of France was so ill-served with cannon for his navy, that in every action there was scarce a ship which had not several pieces burst. These accidents did great damage, and discouraged the French mariners to such a degree, that they became more afraid of their own guns than of those of the English. There are now at Toulon above 2,000 pieces of iron cannon unfit for service. This is an undeniable proof of the weakness and neglect of the French administration, but a more surprising proof of their imbecility is the state of the fortifications that defend the entrance of this very harbour. I have some reason to think that they trusted for its security entirely to our opinion that it must be inaccessible. Capt. E of one of our frigates lately entered the harbour with a contrary wind, which by obliging him to tack, afforded an opportunity of sounding the whole breadth and length of the passage. He came in without a pilot, and made a pretence of buying cordage or some other stores, but the French officers were much chagrined at the boldness of his enterprise. They alleged that he came for no other reason but to sound the channel, and that he had an engineer aboard, who made drawings of the land and the forts, their bearings and distances. In all probability, these suspicions were communicated to the ministry, for an order immediately arrived that no stranger should be admitted into the docks and arsenal. Part of the road from hence to Marseille lies through a vast mountain, which resembles that of Estrelles, but is not so well covered with wood, though it has the advantage of an agreeable stream running through the bottom. I was much pleased with Marseille, which is indeed a noble city, large, populous, and flourishing. The streets of what is called the New Town are open, airy, and spacious. The house is well built and even magnificent. The harbour is an oval basin, surrounded on every side either by the buildings or the land, so that the shipping lies perfectly secure, and here is generally an incredible number of vessels. On the city side there is a semicircular quay of freestone, which extends 1,300 paces, and the space between this and the houses that front it is continually filled with a surprising crowd of people. The galleys, to the number of 8 or 9, are moored with their sterns to one part of the wharf, and the slaves are permitted to work for their own benefit at their respective occupations, in little shops or booths, which they rent for a trifle. There you see tradesmen of all kinds sitting at work, chained by one foot, shoemakers, tailors, silversmiths, watch and clockmakers, barbers, stocking weavers, jewellers, pattern drawers, scriveners, booksellers, cutlers, and all manner of shopkeepers. They pay about 2 sols a day to the king for this indulgence, live well and look jolly, and can afford to sell their goods and labour much cheaper than other dealers and tradesmen. At night, however, they are obliged to lie aboard. Notwithstanding the great face of business at Marseille, their trade is greatly on the decline, and their merchants are failing every day. This decay of commerce is in a great measure owing to the English, who at the peace poured in such a quantity of European merchandise into Martinique and Guadeloupe, that when the merchants of Marseille sent over their cargoes, They found the markets overstocked, and were obliged to sell for a considerable loss. Besides, the French colonists had such a stock of sugars, coffee, and other commodities lying by them during the war, that upon the first notice of peace, they shipped them off in great quantities for Marseille. I am told that the produce of the islands is at present cheaper here than where it grows, and on the other hand, the merchandise of this country sells for less money at Martinique than in Provence. A single person who travels in this country may live at a reasonable rate in these towns by eating at the public ordinaries, but I would advise all families that come hither to make any stay to take furnished lodgings as soon as they can, for the expense of living at an hotel is enormous. I was obliged to pay at Marseille 4 livres a head for every meal, and half that price for my servant, and was charged 6 livres a day besides for the apartment, so that our daily expense, including breakfast and a valet de place, amounted to 2 louis d'ors. The same imposition prevails all over the south of France, though it is generally supposed to be the cheapest and most plentiful part of the kingdom. Without all doubt, it must be owing to the folly and extravagance of English travellers, who have allowed themselves to be fleeced without wincing, until this extortion is become authorized by custom. It is very disagreeable riding in the avenues of Marseille, because you are confined in a dusty high road, crowded with carriages and beasts of burden, between 2 white walls, the reflection from which, while the sun shines, is intolerable. But in this neighbourhood there is a vast number of pleasant country houses, called bastides, said to amount to 12,000, some of which may be rented ready furnished at a very reasonable price. Marseille is a gay city, and the inhabitants indulge themselves in a variety of amusements. They have assemblies, a concert spiritual, and a comedy. Here is also a spacious cours, or walk shaded with trees, to which in the evening there is a great resort of well-dressed people. Marseille being a free port, there is a bureau about half a league from the city on the road to Aix, where all carriages undergo examination, and if anything contraband is found, the vehicle, baggage, and even the horses are confiscated. We escaped this disagreeable ceremony by the sagacity of our driver. Of his own accord, he declared at the bureau that we had bought a pound of coffee and some sugar at Marseille, and were ready to pay the duty, which amounted to about 10 sols. They took the money, gave him a receipt, and let the carriage pass without further question. I proposed to stay one night only at Aix, but Mr. R., who is here, had found such benefit from drinking the waters, that I was persuaded to make trial of them for 8 or 10 days. I have accordingly taken private lodgings, and drank them at the fountainhead, not without finding considerable benefit. In my next I shall say something further of these waters, though I am afraid they will not prove a source of much entertainment. It will be sufficient for me to find them contribute in any degree to the health of dear sir, yours assuredly. Letter XL. Boulogne, May 23, 1765. Dear Doctor, I found 3 English families at Aix, with whom I could have passed my time very agreeably, but the society is now dissolved. Mr. SRE and his lady left the place in a few days after we arrived. Mr. R. and Lady Betty are gone to Geneva, and Mr. GR with his family remains at Aix. This gentleman, who laboured under a most dreadful nervous asthma, has obtained such relief from this climate that he intends to stay another year in the place, and Mr. R. found surprising benefit from drinking the waters for a scorbutical complaint. As I was incommoded by both these disorders, I could not but in justice to myself try the united efforts of the air and the waters, especially as this consideration was reinforced by the kind and pressing exhortations of Mr. R. and Lady Betty, which I could not in gratitude resist. Aix, the capital of Provence, is a large city, watered by the small river R. It was a Roman colony, said to be founded by Caius Sextus Calvinus, above a century before the birth of Christ. From the source of mineral water here found, added to the consul's name, it was called Aquae Sextiae. It was here that Marius, the conqueror of the Teutons, fixed his headquarters, and embellished the place with temples, aqueducts, and thermae, of which, however, nothing now remains. The city as it now stands is well built, though the streets in general are narrow and kept in a very dirty condition. But it has a noble cours planted with double rows of tall trees, and adorned with 3 or 4 fine fountains, the middlemost of which discharges hot water supplied from the source of the baths. On each side there is a row of elegant houses, inhabited chiefly by the noblesse, of which there is here a considerable number. The Parliament, which is held at Aix, brings hither a great resort of people, and as many of the inhabitants are persons of fashion, They are well-bred, gay, and sociable. The Duc de Villers, who is governor of the province, resides on the spot, and keeps an open assembly, where strangers are admitted without reserve, and made very welcome if they will engage in play, which is the sole occupation of the whole company. Some of our English people complain that when they were presented to him, they met with a very cold reception. The French, as well as other foreigners, have no idea of a man of family and fashion without the title of Duke, Count, Marquis, or Lord, and where an English gentleman is introduced by the simple expression of Monsieur tell Mr. such a thing, they think he is some plebeian, unworthy of any particular attention. Aix is situated in a bottom, almost surrounded by hills, which however do not screen it from the biz or north wind, that blows extremely sharp in the winter and spring, rendering the air almost insupportably cold, and very dangerous to those who have some kinds of pulmonary complaints, such as tubercules, abscesses, or spitting of blood. Lord H., who passed part of last winter in this place, afflicted with some of these symptoms, grew worse every day while he continued at Aix, but he no sooner removed to Marseilles than all his complaints abated. Such a difference there is in the air of these two places, though the distance between them does not exceed 10 or 12 miles. But the air of Marseilles, though much more mild than that of Aix in the winter, is not near so warm as the climate of Nice, where we find in plenty such flowers, fruit, and vegetables, even in the severest season, as will not grow and ripen, either at Marseilles or Toulon. If the air of Aix is disagreeably cold in the winter, it is rendered quite insufferable in the summer, from excessive heat, occasioned by the reflection from the rocks and mountains, which at the same time obstruct the circulation of air. For it must be observed that the same mountains which serve as funnels and canals to collect and discharge the keen blasts of winter will provide screens to intercept entirely the faint breezes of summer. Aix, though pretty well provided with butcher's meat, is very ill supplied with potherbs, and they have no poultry but what comes at a vast distance from the Lyonnois. They say their want of roots, cabbage, cauliflower, etc., is owing to a scarcity of water, but the truth is they are very bad gardeners. Their oil is good and cheap, their wine is indifferent, but their chief care seems employed on the culture of silk, the staple of Provence, which is everywhere shaded with plantations of mulberry trees for the nourishment of the worms. Notwithstanding the boasted cheapness of every article of housekeeping, in the south of France, I am persuaded a family may live for less money at York, Durham, Hereford, and in many other cities of England than at Aix in Provence, keep a more plentiful table, and be much more comfortably situated in all respects. I found lodging and provision at Aix 50% dearer than at Montpellier, which is counted the dearest place in Languedoc. The baths of Aix, so famous in antiquity, were quite demolished by the eruptions of the barbarians. The very source of the water was lost, till the beginning of the present century, I think the year 1704, when it was discovered by accident, in digging for the foundation of a house, at the foot of a hill, just without the city wall. Near the same place was found a small stone altar, with the figure of a Priapus and some letters in capitals, which the antiquarians have differently interpreted. From this figure, it was supposed that the waters were efficacious in cases of barrenness. It was a long time, however, before any person would venture to use them internally, as it did not appear that they had ever been drank by the Antients. On their reappearance, they were chiefly used for baths to horses and other beasts which had the mange and other cutaneous eruptions. At length poor people began to bathe in them for the same disorders, and received such benefit from them as attracted the attention of more curious inquirers. A very superficial and imperfect analysis was made and published, with a few remarkable histories of the cures they had performed, by 3 different physicians of those days, and those little treatises, I suppose, encouraged valetudinarians to drink them without ceremony. They were found serviceable in the gout, the gravel, scurvy, dropsy, palsy, indigestion, asthma, and consumption, and their fame soon extended itself all over Languedoc, Gascony, Dauphine, and Provence. The magistrates, with a view to render them more useful and commodious, have raised a plain building, in which there are a couple of private baths, with a bedchamber adjoining to each, where individuals may use them both internally and externally, for a moderate expense. These baths are paved with marble, and supplied with water each by a large brass cock, which you can turn at pleasure. At one end of this edifice there is an octagon, open at top, having a basin with a stone pillar in the middle, which discharges water from the same source all round by 8 small brass cocks, And hither people of all ranks come of a morning with their glasses, to drink the water or wash their sores, or subject their contracted limbs to the stream. This last operation, called the douche, however, is more effectually undergone in the private bath, where the stream is much more powerful. The natural warmth of this water, as nearly as I can judge from recollection, is about the same degree of temperature with that in the Queen's Bath, at Bath in Somersetshire. It is perfectly transparent, sparkling in the glass, light and agreeable to the taste, and may be drank without any preparation, to the quantity of 3 or 4 pints at a time. There are many people at Aix who swallow 14 half-pint glasses every morning, during the season which is in the month of May, though it may be taken with equal benefit all the year round. It has no sensible operation but by urine, an effect which pure water would produce, if drank in the same quantity. If we may believe those who have published their experiments, this water produces neither agitation, cloud, or change of colour, when mixed with acids, alkalis, tincture of galls, syrup of violets, or solution of silver. The residue, after boiling, evaporation, and filtration, affords a very small proportion of purging salt, and calcareous earth, which last ferments with strong acids. As I had neither hydrometer nor thermometer to ascertain the weight and warmth of this water, nor time to procure the proper utensils, to make the preparations, and repeat the experiments necessary to exhibit a complete analysis, I did not pretend to enter upon this process, but contented myself with drinking, bathing, and using the douche, which perfectly answered my expectation, having in 8 days almost cured an ugly scorbutic tetter, which had for some time deprived me of the use of my right hand. I observed that the water, when used externally, left always a kind of oily appearance on the skin, that when we boiled it at home in an earthen pot, the steam smelled like those of sulphur, and even affected my lungs in the same manner, but the bath itself smelled strong of a limekiln. The water, after standing all night in a bottle, yielded a remarkably vinous taste and odour, something analogous to that of dulcified spirit of nitre. Whether the active particles consist of a volatile vitriol, or a very fine petroleum, or a mixture of both, I shall not pretend to determine, but the best way I know of discovering whether it is really impregnated with a vitriolic principle, too subtle and fugitive for the usual operations of chemistry, is to place bottles, filled with wine, in the bath or adjacent room, which wine, if there is really a volatile acid in any considerable quantity, will be pricked in 8 and 40 hours. Having ordered our coach to be refitted, and provided with fresh horses, as well as with another postilion, in consequence of which improvements, I paid at the rate of a louis d'or per diem to Lyons and back again, we departed from Aix, and the second day of our journey passing the Durance in boat lay at Avignon. This river, the Druncher of the Antients, is a considerable stream, extremely rapid, which descends from the mountains and discharges itself in the Rhône. After violent rains it extends its channel, so as to be impassable, and often overflows the country to a great extent. In the middle of a plain betwixt Organ and this river, we met the coach in which we had travelled 18 months before, from Lyons to Montpellier, conducted by our old driver Joseph, who no sooner recognized my servant at a distance by his musketoon than he came running towards our carriage, and seizing my hand, even shed tears of joy. Joseph had been travelling through Spain, and was so embrowned by the sun, that he might have passed for an Iroquois. I was much pleased with the marks of gratitude which the poor fellow expressed towards his benefactors. He had some private conversation with our voiturier, whose name was Claude, to whom he gave such a favourable character of us, as in all probability induced him to be wonderfully obliging during the whole journey. You know Avignon is a large city belonging to the Pope. It was the Avenio Cavarum of the Antients, and changed masters several times, belonging successively to the Romans, Burgundians, Franks, the kingdom of Arles, the counts of Provence, and the sovereigns of Naples. It was sold in the 14th century, by Queen Jane I of Naples, to Pope Clement VI, for the sum of 80,000 florins, and since that period has continued under the dominion of the See of Rome. Not but that when the Duc de Crequy, the French ambassador, was insulted at Rome in the year 1662, the Parliament of Provence passed an arrêt, declaring the city of Avignon, and the county Venice in part of the ancient domain of Provence, and therefore reunited it to the crown of France, which accordingly took possession, though it was afterwards restored to the Roman See at the Peace of Pisa. The Pope, however, holds it by a precarious title, at the mercy of the French king, who may one day be induced to resume it, upon payment of the original purchase money. As a succession of popes resided here for the space of 70 years, the city could not fail to be adorned with a great number of magnificent churches and convents, which are richly embellished with painting, sculpture, shrines, relics, and tombs. Among the last is that of the celebrated Laura, whom Petrarch has immortalized by his poetry, and for whom Francis I of France took the trouble to write an epitaph. Avignon is governed by a vicelegate from the Pope, and the police of the city is regulated by the consuls. It is a large place, situated in a fruitful plain, surrounded by high walls built of hewn stone which on the west side are washed by the Rhone. Here was a noble bridge over the river, but it is now in ruins. On the other side a branch of the Sorgue runs through part of the city. This is the river anciently called Sulga, formed by the famous fountain of Vaucluse in this neighbourhood, where the poet Petrarch resided. It is a charming transparent stream, abounding with excellent trout and crawfish. We passed over it on a stone bridge in our way to Orange, the Arrosio Cavarum of the Romans, still distinguished by some noble monuments of antiquity. These consist of a circus, an aqueduct, a temple, and a triumphal arch, which last was erected in honour of Caius Marius and Luctatius Catulus, after the great victory they obtained in this country over the Cimbri and Teutons. It is a very magnificent edifice, adorned on all sides with trophies and battles in basso relievo. The ornaments of the architecture and the sculpture are wonderfully elegant for the time in which it was erected, and the whole is surprisingly well preserved, considering its great antiquity. It seems to me to be as entire and perfect as the arch of Septimius Severus at Rome. Next day we passed two very impetuous streams, the Drome and the Isar. The first, which very much resembles the Var, we forded, but the Isar we crossed in a boat, which as well as that upon the Durance is managed by the trail, a movable or running pulley, on a rope stretched between two wooden machines erected on the opposite sides of the river. The contrivance is simple and effectual, and the passage equally safe and expeditious. The boatman has nothing to do, but by means of a long massy rudder, to keep the head obliquely to the stream, the force of which pushes the boat along, the block to which it is fixed sliding upon the rope from one side to the other. All these rivers take their rise from the mountains, which are continued through Provence and Dauphine and fall into the Rhone, and all of them, when swelled by sudden rains, overflow the flat country. Although Dauphine affords little or no oil, it produces excellent wines, particularly those of Hermitage and Côte-Rôtie. The first of these is sold on the spot for 3 livres the bottle, and the other for 2. The country likewise yields a considerable quantity of corn and a good deal of grass. It is well watered with streams and agreeably shaded with wood. The weather was pleasant, and we had a continued song of nightingales from Aix to Fontainebleau. I cannot pretend to specify the antiquities of Vienne, anciently called Vienna Allabrogum. It was a Roman colony, and a considerable city, which the Antients spared no pains and expense to embellish. It is still a large town, standing among several hills on the banks of the Rhone, though all its former splendour is eclipsed, its commerce decayed, and most of its antiquities are buried in ruins. The church of Notre Dame de la Vie was undoubtedly a temple. On the left of the road, as you enter it by the gate of Avignon, there is a handsome obelisk, or rather pyramid about 30 feet high, raised upon a vault supported by 4 pillars of the Tuscan order. It is certainly a Roman work, and Montfaucon supposes it to be a tomb, as he perceived an oblong stone jetting out from the middle of the vault, in which the ashes of the defunct were probably contained. The story of Pontius Pilate, who is said to have ended his days in this place, is a fable. On the 7th day of our journey from Aix, we arrived at Lyon, where I shall take my leave of you for the present, being with great truth yours, etc. Letter Roman 41. Boulogne, June 13, 1765. Dear Sir, I am at last in a situation to indulge my view with a sight of Britain, after an absence of 2 years, and indeed you cannot imagine what pleasure I feel while I survey the white cliffs of Dover, at this distance. Not that I am at all affected by the Nescia qua dulcidine natalis soli, of Horace. That seems to be a kind of fanaticism founded on the prejudices of education, which induces a Laplander to place the terrestrial paradise among the snows of Norway, and a Swiss to prefer the barren mountains of Saler to the fruitful plains of Lombardy. I am attached to my country because it is the land of liberty, cleanliness, and convenience, but I love it still more tenderly as the scene of all my interesting connections, as the habitation of my friends, for whose conversation, correspondence, and esteem I wish alone to live. Our journey hither from Lyon produced neither accident nor adventure worth notice, but abundance of little vexations, which may be termed the plagues of posting. At Lyon, where we stayed only a few days, I found a return coach, which I hired to Paris for 6 louis d'ors. It was a fine roomy carriage, elegantly furnished and made for travelling, so strong and solid in all its parts, that there was no danger of its being shaken to pieces by the roughness of the road. But its weight and solidity occasioned so much friction between the wheels and the axletry, that we ran the risque of being set on fire 3 or 4 times a day. Upon a just comparison of all circumstances, posting is much more easy, convenient, and reasonable in England than in France. The English carriages, horses, harness, and roads are much better, and the postilions more obliging and alert. The reason is plain and obvious. If I am illused at the post-house in England, I can be accommodated elsewhere. The publicans on the road are sensible of this, and therefore they vie with each other in giving satisfaction to travellers. But in France, where the post is monopolized, the postmasters and postilions, knowing that the traveller depends entirely upon them, are the more negligent and remiss in their duty, as well as the more encouraged to insolence and imposition. Indeed, the stranger seems to be left entirely at the mercy of those fellows, except in large towns, where he may have recourse to the magistrate or commanding officer. The post stands very often by itself in a lone country situation, or in a paltry village where the postmaster is the principal inhabitant, and in such a case, if you should be ill-treated by being supplied with bad horses, if you should be delayed on frivolous pretenses in order to extort money, if the postilions should drive at a wagon pace with a view to provoke your impatience, or should you in any shape be insulted by them or their masters, and I know not any redress you can have, except by a formal complaint to the controller of the posts, who is generally one of the ministers of state, and pays little or no regard to any such representations. I know an English gentleman, the brother of an earl, who wrote a letter of complaint to the Duc de Villers, governor of Provence, against the postmaster of Antibes, who had insulted and imposed upon him. The Duke answered his letter, promising to take order that the grievance should be redressed, and never thought of it after. Another great inconvenience which attends posting in France is that if you are retarded by any accident, you cannot in many parts of the kingdom find a lodging, without perhaps travelling 2 or 3 posts farther than you would choose to go, to the prejudice of your health, and even the hazard of your life. Whereas on any part of the post road in England, you will meet with tolerable accommodation at every stage. Through the whole south of France, except in large cities, the inns are cold, damp, dark, dismal, and dirty, the landlords equally disobliging and rapacious, the servants awkward, sluttish, and slothful, and the postilions lazy, lounging, greedy, and impertinent. If you chide them for lingering, they will continue to delay you the longer. If you chastise them with sword, cane, cudgel, or horsewhip, they will either disappear entirely and leave you without resource, or they will find means to take vengeance by overturning your carriage. The best method I know of travelling with any degree of comfort is to allow yourself to become the dupe of imposition and stimulate their endeavours by extraordinary gratifications. I laid down a resolution and kept it to give no more than 24 souls per post between the 2 postilions, but I am now persuaded that for 3d a post more I should have been much better served, and should have performed the journey with much greater pleasure. We met with no adventures upon the road worth reciting. The first day we were retarded about 2 hours by the Duchess d'Ile, and her son the Duc de RFT, who by virtue of an order from the minister had anticipated all the horses at the post. They accosted my servant, and asked if his master was a lord. He thought proper to answer in the affirmative, upon which the Duke declared that he must certainly be of French extraction, inasmuch as he observed the lilies of France in his arms on the coach. This young nobleman spoke a little English. He asked whence we had come, and understanding we had been in Italy, desired to know whether the man liked France or Italy best. Upon his giving France the preference, he clapped him on the shoulder, and said he was a lad of good taste. The Duchess asked if her son spoke English well, and seemed mightily pleased when my man assured her he 999. They were much more free and condescending with my servant than with myself, for though we saluted them in passing and were even supposed to be persons of quality, they did not open their lips while we stood close by them at the inn door till their horses were changed. They were going to Geneva, and their equipage consisted of 3 coaches and 6, with 5 domestics à horseback. The Duchess was a tall, thin, raw-boned woman with her head close shaved. This delay obliged us to lie 2 posts short of Macon, at a solitary auberge called Maison Blanche, which had nothing white about it but the name. The Lyonnois is one of the most agreeable and best cultivated countries I ever beheld, diversified with hill, dale, wood, and water, laid out in extensive cornfields and rich meadows, well stocked with black cattle, and adorned with a surprising number of towns, villages, villas, and convents, generally situated on the brows of gently swelling hills, so that they appear to the greatest advantage. What contributes in a great measure to the beauty of this, and the Macanois, is the charming pastoral Somme, which from the city of Chalons winds its silent course so smooth and gentle, that one can scarce discern which way its current flows. It is this placid appearance that tempts so many people to bathe in it at Lyons, where a good number of individuals are drowned every summer, whereas there is no instance of any persons thus perishing in the Rhône, the rapidity of it deterring every body from bathing in its stream. Next night we passed at Beaune, where we found nothing good but the wine, for which we paid 40 sols the bottle. At Chalons our axletree took fire, an accident which detained us so long that it was 10 before we arrived at Auxerre, where we lay. In all probability we must have lodged in the coach, had not we been content to take 4 horses and pay for 6, 2 posts successively. The alternative was, either to proceed with 4 on those terms, or stay till the other horses should come in and be refreshed. In such an emergency, I would advise the traveller to put up with the 4, and he will find the postilions so much upon their mettle, that those stages will be performed sooner than the others in which you have the full complement. There was an English gentleman laid up at Auxerre with a broken arm, to whom I sent my compliments with offers of service, but his servant told my man that he did not choose to see any company, and had no occasion for my service. This sort of reserve seems peculiar to the English disposition. When 2 natives of any other country chance to meet abroad, they run into each other's embrace like old friends, even though they have never heard of one another till that moment. Whereas 2 Englishmen in the same situation maintain a mutual reserve and diffidence, and keep without the sphere of each other's attraction, like 2 bodies endowed with a repulsive power. We only stopped to change horses at Dijon, the capital of Burgundy, which is a venerable old city, but we passed part of a day at Sens, and visited a manufacture of that stuff we call Manchester velvet, which is here made and dyed to great perfection, under the direction of English workmen who have been seduced from their own country. At Fontainebleau we went to see the palace, or as it is called, the castle, which, though an irregular pile of building, affords a great deal of lodging, and contains some very noble apartments, particularly the hall of audience with the king's and queen's chambers, upon which the ornaments of carving and gilding are lavished with profusion rather than propriety. Here are some rich parterres of flower garden, and a noble orangery, which, however, we did not greatly admire, after having lived among the natural orange groves of Italy. Hitherto we had enjoyed fine summer weather, and I found myself so well that I imagined my health was entirely restored. But betwixt Fontainebleau and Paris we were overtaken by a black storm of rain, sleet, and hail, which seemed to reinstate winter in all its rigour, for the cold weather continues to this day. There was no resisting this attack. I caught cold immediately, and this was reinforced at Paris, where I stayed but 3 days. The same man, Pascal Cellier, Rue Guénégaud, Fauxbourg St. Germain, who owned the coach that brought us from Lyon, supplied me with a returned Berlin to Boulogne for 6 louis d'ors, and we came hither by easy journeys. The first night we lodged at Bretuel, where we found an elegant inn and very good accommodation. But the next we were forced to take up our quarters at the house where we had formerly passed a very disagreeable night at Abbeville. I am now in tolerable lodging, where I shall remain a few weeks, merely for the sake of a little repose. Then I shall gladly tempt that invidious strait which still divides you from yours. 100.